Hey everyone, it's Warlord 1929 and today's video is my opinions on every Warframe, except for Lavos, Zaku and Caliban, as I don't have them, and for other reasons, as you'll find out in the video. From an MR20 player with 1300 hours experience, the ability tests are done on level 125 heavy gunners, and comparisons to the normal situation will be from an endgame perspective, this being mainly Steel Path. This is also based around the frame's ability to be used effectively in the current meta of the game, this being damage/CC oriented. All ability testing will use unique builds based on my opinion on the best ability for the particular frame. Unfortunately, some of these builds aren't used are the best possible, as I have yet to react to some frames, so I apologize if your favorite frame doesn't get their due diligence. At the end of the segment for each frame, I will also give them a tier list style rating, ranging from D to S. This is also purely my opinion, and you are welcome to your own. Let's get started. With Ashe. Ability Showcase. Shuriken. Ashe throws a shuriken at the enemy in line of sight. A single target projectile that does laughable damage at decent levels. As such, the best use of this ability is with the augment Seeking Shuriken, which strips the armor of the enemy hit with the shuriken, opening the enemy up for Ashe's stronger damage abilities. Smokescreen. Ashe throws down a smoke bomb, turning invisible for a set duration. It is a semi-decent invisibility ability, still worse than later frames though, and if you want to build for this, you would need a max duration build, which takes away from his stronger aspects as a frame. Not to mention the fact that being invisible for a long time isn't amazing outside of Spy, unless you're going to rely on gun damage for the majority of your DPS. Smoke Shadow. This augment allows Smokescreen to work on allies as well, but this doesn't do anything for Ashe himself. Teleport. Ashe teleports to the target. A mediocre movement ability with some niche use if you can't close the distance to a ranged target, but otherwise pretty poor. Onto the holy grail of Ashe's damage, the Fatal Teleport augment. This is undoubtedly Ashe's best way of killing enemies using the combo of any dagger plus covert lethality. This ability also has a rather funny interaction with his four. Blade Storm. Ashe summons his clones to attack enemies marked by looking at them with the camera. A relatively strong multi-target DPS ability with insane damage potential when combined with his 3 and a strength build. However, it is limited by line of sight and its time to kill is quite slow, relying on the slash damage. As a side note, the funny interaction with this ability's interaction is if teleport is used whilst Blade Storm is active, Ashe will randomly trade places with his clones. Rising Storm. This augment allows for the clones to build your combo when in use, and also gives you extended combo duration, which is used with a melee build, can make for a decent combo. Steel Path. Onto the Steel Path analysis. Now, I didn't do this when playing Ashe, but his best playstyle is to start with his 1 to strip the enemy's armor, and then use his 4 or Fatal Teleport to secure the kill. Ashe is much better against Corpus than Grineer, even when taking into account Seeking Shuriken, due to the time to kill of his 4 being much lower on Corpus compared to the Grineer. As the gameplay shows, Ashe performs pretty well, only really struggling with durability, which can be easily covered with mods or invisibility. However, his time to kill is a pretty big problem, having to wait several seconds for his immense damage to kick in, and while Fatal Teleport can provide a very quick insta-kill, it also doesn't have iframes and can leave you open to a decent quick burst of damage that insta-kills you. Doesn't really need to use the helmet system due to having 4 decent usable abilities. Overall, a decent frame, but suffers from a long time to kill and mediocre durability that can be partially solved with invis, but to make that worthwhile, you need to build for duration, which doesn't benefit his better abilities at all. A. Atlas. Ability Showcase. Landslide. Atlas dashes forward and punches the target. Landslide is a single target damage ability that does decent damage, and when combined with his 3, his damage can scale rather high. This does, however, also rely on building a high combo multiplier, which isn't difficult against decently leveled enemies, and due to this, his ability and Blood Rush work perfectly with each other. This ability also helps build his passive Rubble when combined with his 3, giving him some much needed survivability. His main landslide augment is Path of Statues. It leaves a trail that petrifies enemies in the trail after a landslide. His other more useful augment is Rubble Heap. which affects his landslide when at high rubble, making it have no energy cost and doubles the damage and speed. Tectonics. Tectonics is a single target summon ability, with Atlas summoning a rock wall for him to use as cover, despite it being as much use as a Grineer Bulwark for that purpose. Its other effect is pressing the ability button again, which turns the rock wall into a boulder that does pitiful damage, and has limited CC, and as such makes for a near useless ability. Tectonic Fracture. This augment is a non-factor, simply increasing its health without changing its floors. Petrify. Atlas gazes at the target and turns them to stone. This is arguably his best ability, really only rivaled by Landslide. Petrify is a multi-target CC ability that completely stops the enemies from attacking or even moving. This is also vital due to it being required to build one of his pass effects in Rumble. This system works by petrifying the enemy before punching it with Landslide, thus building his Rumble, aiding his lackluster durability. Orgaze. This augment increases loot drops, but was really only ever useful for the now irrelevant Shidu farm. Rumblers. Atlas summons 2 Rumblers to fight for him. This is a multi-target summon ability, summoning 2 rock golems to fight for Atlas. However, these golems deal next to no damage and mediocre CC, with their best use is that enemies are petrified when the golems are summoned. They also work as a niche distraction to take some aggro from the enemies, and after dying drop healing rubble healing Atlas. This ability ends up acting as a niche support. Titanic Rumbler. This augment changes from 2 rumblers to 1 stronger one, which is okay, but the damage is still pitiful. It can however be used as a shockwave like CC when the ability button is pressed again. Still Path. To my surprise, Atlas performed quite well in the Still Path tests. Atlas's main playstyle is to cast his 1 in 3 as much as possible, as this builds your rubble, which is vital for his survivability. Other than that, you can essentially spam your 1 for damage as long as you have a half decent combo going. While you can cast his 4, it really only acts as a distraction, and a niche one at that. Atlas performs identically against all factions due to the damage he outputs, making armor a non-factor. Atlas doesn't really struggle at all, his only problem is that you have no rubble. You will get one shot without the damage reduction, which means managing your rubble is a must to avoid dying constantly. He would also benefit from using the helmet system, replacing his 2 without affecting his main kit. Overall, a decent frame with just lackluster survivability, and requires a high combo multiplier to get his outstanding damage. B+. Banshee. Ability Showcase. Sonic Boom. Banshee screams at the floor, knocking back enemies in range. This is a multi-target CC ability that is only ever useful for knocking an enemy off the map, and is not viable for damage. Sonic Fracture. This augment makes it armor strip, not making it completely useless, but there are far superior options for armor strip in comparison to this. Sonar. Banshee emits a sonar wave, creating weak spots on any enemy in range. This is Banshee's best ability by far due to the weak spots added to the enemies, allowing for absurd damage with certain weapons. However, this does require you to use gun damage as your main source of damage, as abilities cannot target these weak spots. Resonance. This augment makes it so when a weak spot is shown, a resonating sonar is launched from the target, and thus uses the ability again, increasing overall possible DPS. Silence. Banshee silences everyone and herself in a certain range, silencing all weapon sounds and alarms. This is a multi-target CC, if you can even call that. While this ability does have an use of farming focus, or making spies slightly easier, because it was really hard as it is, right guys? Regardless of that, those niches this ability is still completely useless, and is really never casted. Savage Silence. This augment merely increases finisher damage while silence is active, making it somewhat okay for a finisher oriented build. Soundquake. Banshee shakes the ground, doing AoE damage to enemies in range. This is a multi-target CC/DPS ability in a wide range that constantly damages and knocks enemies back. In lower level gameplay, this is easily her best ability, working well as a long range map nuker on low level enemies, making wave clearing easy on defense for example. However, in higher level gameplay, this ability is borderline useless, really only working as a large range CC. This ability also has immense energy drain, causing slight problems, but they are easy manageable. Resonating Quake. This augment is quite useful with the slight trade-off of decreasing the damage the further away from the epicenter the enemy is, but at the center, the damage it outputs is immense. Steel Path. Banshee performs averagely in the tests due to Banshee's main playstyle being to cast her 2 and only her 2, and relies solely on gun damage in most cases. She did, as always, struggle with survivability, as having a base of 100 armor is simply not good enough, causing her to get one-shotted by many enemies. You could cast her 4 to seize the whole map for a period of time, but you aren't likely to get any meaningful damage out of that. But with a half-decent weapon, you can rather easily clear through the enemies with the sonar damage buff, increasing your gun damage dramatically, and allowing for even a glass cannon like Banshee to survive through the content. Banshee would also benefit from the helmet system, as she has 2 free abilities to replace with whatever you want really. Overall, she has always been a glass cannon, but now solely relying on sonar and gun damage to clear content isn't good enough anymore. C+. Baruuk. Ability Showcase. Elude. Baruuk does not attack, and becomes completely invincible to projectile based damage from a 180 degree range without mods. This ability is survivability based, and allows for Baruuk to take 0 damage as long as he is completely still. This also has another effect which allows him to reduce his restraint when shot at. This ability can reach a 360 degree negation of damage, but this requires building for max range. Elude at the time of writing does not have an augment. LOL. Baruuk puts the enemies in a select range to sleep. This ability is a multi-target CC that puts enemies to sleep. This also has the adverse effect of lowering his restraint. This also has the niche use of resetting alarm levels for farming focus. Endless Lullaby. This augment makes a lull trigger again for the remaining duration after performing a finisher on a sleeping enemy. This increases the amount of enemies that can be CC'd at once. Desolate Hands. Baruuk disarms the enemies in his range of their weapons and gains damage reduction. This ability is arguably his best, with the total damage reduction stacking to a whopping 90%. This can also be used to lower his restraint to add to this while his 1 is active. The range of the disarm is increased. This ability has no augment at the time of writing. Serene Storm. Baruuk activates this ability and begins rapidly increasing his restraint. This ability is a multi-target CC and DPS ability, the damage of which can scale extremely high with high combo multipliers, as well as giving him a base 10% damage reduction while Serene Storm is active. Reactive Storm. This augment affects the ability by changing the elements of the attacks based on the enemy's type being attacked, as well as adding a base 250% status chance to the main attack, comparable to Excalibur's Chromatic Blade augment. Steel Path. Baruuk performs really well in Steel Path due to having the constant 90% damage reduction and decent damage in CC as well, as literally can't die ability while not attacking, making for a really strong combo in Steel Path. Baruuk? Baruuk, yes. Baruuk's main playstyle is to keep either his 1 active constantly if built for range, or his 3 up constantly if built for strength, as this either keeps his elude active in a 360 degree rotation, making you immune to damage as long as you're not attacking, or gives you a base 90% damage reduction, making you nigh unkillable. Both of these are viable for reducing restraint, quickly allowing for you to use your 4th freely to output immense damage with it. However, the energy drain of elude can cause some issues with survivability if built for range, but with Zeneric and energy pads, you should be just fine. He would not benefit from the helmet due to his kit flowing extremely well together. Overall, his frame has evolved from a worse Excalibur into Excalibur with a marginally worse Chromatic Blade and better other abilities than his counterpart, with the sole exception of Radial Blind. A. Caliban, not applicable, as I can't be fucked to farm a geometric fuckton of Nama Isoplast. Despite being known for farming all the frames, this is too much, even for me. Chroma! Ability Showcase. Due to Chroma having a unique ability to switch between elements at will, I will be covering all of the different effects of his 2 abilities that use the passive element change. Spectral Stream. Chroma breathes out an elemental stream of damage. This is a multi-target DPS ability that also inflicts a status condition depending on the element in use. These being Fire. Chroma breathes fire on any enemies being aimed at, and also inflicts a fire status condition upon them, but this does laughable damage and is really worth the cast. Ice. Chroma breathes ice on the enemies being aimed at and inflicts a cold status effect. This also does laughable damage, but is slightly better due to the cold being an overall better status condition than fire. Toxin. Chroma breathes a stream of poison at enemies in range and inflicts a toxin status effect. But again, this still does next to no damage, and the toxin being debatably the worst status effect, and by extension the worst element for Chroma. The main reason for this is that toxin doesn't really do anything special, simply damages them like fire, but fire's elemental ward is the far superior element in this case. Electricity. Chroma breathes a stream of electricity at the enemies Chroma is aiming at, and inflicts an electric status effect. But once again, this still doesn't do anything to make up any decent damage on what is a solely damage based ability, and as such, this still doesn't make it good. The upside of this element is elect chaining to other enemies compared to the other elements. However, in general, cold or elect are the best element for Chroma's 1 or cold due to slowing down enemies, and elect for the aforementioned chain damage. This ability also has an augment and afterburner, which merely shoots a projectile after ending the ability, stacking up to 500 damage depending on how long you use the ability for this. Does nothing to help its force, however. Elemental Ward. E-Ward is an AoE aura around Chroma that has a different effect depending on the element in use. Fire. Chroma summons a fiery aura around himself, damaging enemies in the vicinity. This also has the adverse effect of applying a fire status effect to enemies in the vicinity, on top of the main effect buffing the base health of Chroma. Cold. Chroma summons a cold aura around himself, damaging enemies. The adverse effect is applying the cold status effect, and the main effect of this is the ability having a chance to deflect projectiles that hit Chroma. It also gives a base armor buff to Chroma. Toxin. Chroma summons a toxin aura around himself, damaging enemies around him. The only effect of this aura is the toxin status effect plus the damage from the element. This rather easily makes it the worst element by a large majority. Electricity. Chroma summons an electricity based aura, damaging and chaining the damage between enemies. The main effect is damaging enemies with the electricity status effect, which changes with damage between enemies. This aura also reflects damage and gives a buff to Chroma's base shields. In general, his best element is either fire or cold, but on paper electricity would be his best element. However, that in practice just isn't true, due to the friction from Elec being unreliable to say the least, and shields being just overall worse than health in general. Everlasting Ward is E-Ward's augment, which merely lets teammates keep the buffs when outside his range at a lower strength. This isn't really needed even for support Chroma, due to support Chroma building range anyway. Vex Armor. Chroma envelops himself in armor that has two different effects. The first being Fury, which buffs Chroma's weapon damage based on the damage dealt to Chroma's health. This makes Chroma arguably the best weapon user in the whole game. The other effect is Scorn, which buffs the armor of Chroma based on the damage dealt to Chroma's shields. This also makes him one of the best tanks in the game, and while this ability does require you to take damage, that isn't the hardest criteria to meet in this game. Vexing Retaliation is Vex Armor's augment, and does nothing to affect the ability in a significant manner, as all it does is apply a status effect when taking damage. Effigy. Chroma exits his armor and leaves it in one area, damaging enemies in its vicinity. Depending on Chroma's element, it either uses Spectral Stream of Ice, Fire, Toxin, or Electricity. This also has the niche use of doubling credits for boss kills, such as the Profit Taker. Due to this, Chroma is the best frame for farming the Profit Taker. This also has a CC effect of sending enemies flying when it is in its vicinity. Guided Effigy is the augment of Effigy, and it does some okay improvements such as higher DPS and applying decent CC, but still isn't worth the mod slot in most cases. Steel Path. While the time has come for my main. As a Chroma main, I became depressed when self-damage was removed. However, despite the self-damage removal, Chroma is still an absolute beast when it comes to Steel Path. Even with two of his abilities being borderline useless, his E-Ward and Vex Armor carry this frame to the upper echelon of frames, with both its damage and survivability unrivaled, except for possibly Rhino. He has amazing survivability with his E-Ward, and if playing in a team, his Vex buffs make for great support for squishier targets. As far as damage goes, he does rely solely on weapon damage here, but that isn't a problem at all, as he can clear the same enemies as a DPS god like Mesa with no issue. and have better survivability than the likes of Mesa and Saryn. You should also consider removing either Effigy or Spectral Stream for Empower, or something similar, as these abilities are borderline useless in reality. His playstyle revolves around setting up your Vex buffs by taking some damage and then keeping them up the whole time to maintain his immense damage and damage reduction, and using E-Wall to heal damage or give even more damage reduction with Ice as the element. But in general, Fire is genuinely the way to go. Helmet can increase Chroma's lethality with abilities such as Empower, increasing the buff of his Vex. Overall, Chroma in general thrives in Steel Path and boss missions such as Eidolon Hunts and Prophet Taker fights, due to his kit having great survivability and damage with E-Ward and Vex armor. Don't mess with this beautiful dragon, as he is the be-all, end-all of weapon damage. A. Ember. Ability Showcase. Fireball. Ember shoots a fireball at the target. This is a multi-target AoE damage ability that also inflicts a heat status effect on the targets. The adverse of this effect is it adds to Ember's passive heat meter, which, while decent, is still second best in this aspect due to her 4 existing. Fireball Frenzy is Fireball's augment and merely gives weapons a heat status effect for 40 seconds after casting Fireball. Not really that impactful. Immolation. Ember envelops herself in a fiery aura. This is an aura that when at max heat, Ember gains some much needed damage reduction. This also does AoE damage to enemies in her vicinity. This also passively builds her heat meter. Immolation's augment is Immolated Radiance and gives half of the ability's damage reduction to allies in affinity range, making support Ember somewhat viable, but does nothing for Ember herself. Fire Blast. Ember sends a wave of fire around herself, damaging enemies. This also applies a heat status effect and has the adverse effect of stripping the armor of nearby enemies at the cost of lowering the heat meter drastically. Healing Flame is Fire Blast's augment. It heals Ember for every enemy hit with fire blasts, giving Ember more survivability, but Immolation is just strictly better in general with its damage reduction. Inferno. Ember unleashes a hail of meteors and attacks enemies in her vicinity. This deals AoE damage and greatly increases the heat meter. This also applies a heat status effect. Exothermic is Inferno's augment. This gives a chance for killed enemies to drop energy, lessening the energy drain, but not enough to warrant the mod slot with Zen and energy pads existing. Steel Path. Ember performs well in the Steel Path due to having scaling damage due to her passive ability, and Immolation giving her decent damage reduction and survivability. She also has a somewhat reliable armor strip in her 3, and some okay single target damage in her 1. Her playstyle mainly consists of using her 2 and then her 4 to build heat, and the majority of her DPS, and then using her 3 to armor strip to increase the damage and lower the immense energy drain of Immolation at full meter. She does struggle on targets that do still have armor due to heat being a lackluster status effect in terms of damage in general, and if her heat meter isn't high, Immolation does nothing to help her damage reduction, and she will die in rather quick succession. Ember can benefit from the helmets due to having a pretty much free slot to remove and fireball, while her other 3 abilities flow well together, one of which being vital to her main playstyle. Overall, okay damage potential with her 4, decent survivability with her 2, but a tad situational with a decent utility with armor strip from her 3, and a borderline useless ability in her 1. B+. Equinox. Ability Showcase. Metamorphosis. Equinox swaps between their forms. In day form, this gives a base damage and speed buff, and in night form gives them a base armor and shields buff, fitting the roles well, as day is more damage oriented, while night is more survivability oriented in comparison. Duality is Metamorphosis Augment, with the other form being summoned dealing 300% extra damage, which is pretty decent although unreliable due to the poor AI on the other form. Rest in Rage. Equinox applies an aura in a select range. In day form, this applies a debuff to make enemies take more damage. This also has the adverse effect of speeding the enemies up as well, and in night form, it makes them fall asleep, making for a decent AoE CC ability. Calm and Frenzy is the augment for Rest in Rage. This allows for the effect to be repeated after killing an affected enemy. This effect will only last for the rest of the duration, However, this is great for increasing DPS or establishing area control, with the rest overall a decent augment that is usable whether or not it is worth the mod slot. Probably not, due to it being relatively situational. Pacify and Provoke. Equinox outputs an aura in a select range. In day form, this gives a base buff to allies' ability strength, and at night, this gives a flat buff to their damage reduction. Peaceful Provocation is Pacify and Provoke's augment. The Pacify effect is converting the damage dealt by enemies and applying an aura that slows down enemies by 40%, while the Provoke effect is converts damage dealt to enemies to an aura that gives you an extra 15% ability strength. Not useless, but 15% isn't exactly impactful, and slowing enemies isn't really ever necessary. Mend and Maim. Equinox outputs an aura around herself. In day form, this applies an aura where all enemies in range are inflicted with a slash status effect, it constantly dealing damage. You can use this ability to send a shockwave of damage outwards, dealing massive damage. On the other hand, in night form you passively heal you and your team's shields, and can end the ability early to heal for the amount of shields generated. Energy transfer is Mend and Maim's augment, allowing for the total charges to be conserved when switching forms. This is massively helpful, allowing you to swap between immense damage and healing without requiring time to charge them again. And effective mod slot for sure, as it is their main ability, so an argument can be made for using this in a build. Steel Path. Equinox performs decently in Steel Path due to being able to switch between multiple roles due to her diverse kit, allowing for split-second changes between forms, allowing for the user to use whichever form best fits the situation. At any given time, you can output massive gun and ability damage with her 1, 2, and 4 combined in day form, or make yourself nigh unkillable with damage reduction, bonus shields, and healing with her 1, 3, and 4 night form. Their 2 on Nightfall makes her a decent CC that can also be used to farm focus, due to resetting the alarm levels of enemies, while their 3 on Dayform is helpful for buffing the team's damage. It does nothing to help Equinox themselves. Equinox's main playstyle is mainly be in day form at all times, unless you need to heal or tank large amounts of damage, this requiring using their 2 and 4 on day form to debuff enemies, before using Maim to increase overall DPS, and use their 3 and 4 in night form to maximize healing and damage reduction. However, this is purely up to personal preference based on the user's playstyle. They don't really benefit from Helminth as they have all their bases covered with their base kit. Overall, great frame for nearly any situation, and most roles and scenarios are covered with minimal difficulty. A. Excalibur. Ability Showcase. Slash Dash. Excalibur dashes forward, slicing at the target. This is a single target DPS / movement ability, but performs poorly at both purposes, and due to not dealing nearly enough damage and moving you slower than a bullet jump. Surging Dash is slash dash's augment, and it increases your combo counter by 4 when you hit an enemy with the ability. While this is helpful for maintaining a combo counter, it isn't worth the mod slot, as it's not hard to build combo in the first place. Radial Blind. Excalibur flashes a blinding light, blinding enemies in the range. This is a multi-target CC and performs amazingly, easily disabling multiple groups of enemies and opening them up for finishes. Radiant Finish is Radial Blind's augment. This blinds the enemies, and while doing so increases your finisher damage on blinded enemies by 300%, making it a decent combo when using finisher based damage such as covert lethality. Radial Javelin. Excalibur slams the ground, impaling any enemies on the javelins. This is a multi-target CC ability that immobilizes enemies in range, however this is rather poor at CCing, and does next to no damage. Furious Javelin is Radial Javelin's augment. It increases your melee damage by 5% per enemy hit with the javelin for 12 seconds, making it a decent combo with Exalted Blade, but it isn't really worth the mod slot. Exalted Blade. Excalibur draws his blade, slashing at enemies. This is a DPS ability that is both a close range slash attack and a long range beam sword like attack that does amazing damage. Chromatic Blade is Exalted Blade's augment. This is the holy grail of Excal's damage, allowing for Excalibur's Excalibur to deal any status depending on his emissive colour, allowing for insane damage potential. It has a base status chance of 300% with this augment, as it stacks with status mods and condition overload, making for a powerhouse of both AoE and single target damage. Steel Path. Excalibur performs great in Steel Path. Using his Exalted Blade and combining it with his Radial Blind makes for a nearly unstoppable combo, which allows for extraordinary damage potential, and while his other two abilities aren't amazing, Javelin has some niches, and Slash Dash could occasionally be used as an okay movement ability. His only real weakness is survivability due to not having any way outside of mods to reduce the damage taken from attacks, and as such can come across quite frail. This weakness is slightly rectified on the Umbra version of Excalibur, due to having a near enough free Umbral build. His main playstyle is to keep his 4 up at all times, and occasionally using his 2 to disable nearby enemies. You could also use his 1 and 3 periodically, but it doesn't really do anything to help his damage or CC in any way, shape or form. Using Chromatic Blade and a green energy allows for Exalted Blade to deal corrosive damage, greatly increasing his damage potential, and makes this mod a must for a high damage build. He would benefit from helmets due to having 2 dogshit abilities, and an interesting replacement such as E-War to help his survivability would be helpful to his playstyle, or running around and slashing at everything. Of running around and slashing at anything. Overall, a great overall frame that does a lot of damage and has decent CC, low survivability and 2 lackluster abilities that greatly affect his gameplay and overall damage potential. B+. Frost. Ability Showcase. Freeze. Frost shoots a ball of ice, freezing the target upon impact. This is a single target CC ability that completely immobilizes the enemies in place. This also strips the armor of the affected enemy completely, allowing for a decent combo with weapon damage. Freeze is also used to pop Frost's bubbles when they need to be moved. Freeze Force is Freeze's augment. It merely allows you to cast it on allies, giving them a base 100% cold buff to their weapon damage for 40 seconds. Not useless, but cold isn't a great status effect to begin with. Ice Wave. Frost slams the floor, sending a wave of icicles towards the area he's facing. This is a multi-target DPS ability with some minor CC aspects. The damage aspect is extremely poor, barely scraping the enemies, while the CC aspect is just slightly slowing the enemy approaching, making it borderline useless. And his worst ability by far, and as such, badly needs his buff. Ice Wave Impedance is Ice Wave's augments. It creates a trail of ice that slows down enemies for 12 seconds. Why you would want to do that, I have no idea, as his other abilities just do it better. Snow Globe. Frost summons a globe of ice to protect himself or anything else. This is a globe that can be spawned around anything and everything in the game to protect it from ranged DPS. This is arguably his best ability and is the sole reason he was the king of defense for so long, but even this ability is mediocre at this point. While it does have some decent CC where it freezes the targets upon casting, then slowing enemies inside. This also has the weakness of not protecting targets from melee damage if they are inside the globe. This does, however, do nothing for operator defense missions as the target moves around quite annoyingly. Chilling Globe is Snow Globe's augment. This is an RNG based augment, but is pretty decent, as it increases the CC potential of Snow Globe, allowing for it to have a 50% chance to freeze enemies when inside the globe, which is an upgrade on base merely slowing the enemies down. Avalanche. Frost drops ice from above, freezing all targets in range. This is an AoE ability that deals decent damage, completely immobilizes all enemies in range, and also strips the armor, which can make this easily his best ability by a mile. The one for this ability has is the immense energy drain, but this is easily rectified due to the existence of energy pads in Zeneric, Energy Dash, or Arcane Energize. This is a really good CC ability, and the sole reason he can be used effectively outside of defense missions. Icy Avalanche is Avalanche's augment. When Avalanche is cast, it gives all allies an icy coat that absorbs 60 damage per enemy, with the original Avalanche making it a decent tool for group play, but useless for solo play and Frost himself. Steel Path. In everything but defense, the only reason why Frost did anything of note is because of his 4. This ability carries him to the point of absurdity. On defense, however, his 3 is also used, and his 1 is used periodically just to pop his bubble when they need to be moved, but even his 3 underperforms massively in Still Path defense, dying in mere seconds, forcing you to constantly recast the ability or spam 4 just to keep the objective alive. And as for damage, he has none. Frost solely relies on Avalanche to armor strip and immobilize enemies, and then using gun damage for the kills. Frost's playstyle in Still Path consists of him periodically using his 4 to armor strip, and then using gun damage for the kills. In defense, you will use his 3 and 1 as well, but they don't really do anything. His 1 only being used to move bubbles, and his 3 going down in seconds, even with max armor and strength builds. Helmets can benefit him depending on the ability used, as his 2 is a free slot, so you can try some interesting combos with his base kit. Overall, oh how the mighty have fallen. The once king of defense isn't even the best in his home field anymore, with another frame coming after him, doing this job just straight up better, and with better options for damage and damage reduction. He has 2 useless abilities, 1 good one, and 1 decent one, but he just isn't the best at anything, performing averagely in every mission type, but defense based ones, and even then he is outclassed. C+. Gara. Ability Showcase. Shattered Lash. Gara summons a lash from glass and whips enemies with it, either in a single target projectile or an AoE arc. This is a single target or AoE DPS ability that has some niche CC, in that the arc also knocks down enemies, but it isn't great at DPS. This ability instead being usually combined with her 2 and 4 for an absurd damage combo. While having a 2-up, use Gara's 1 outside of her Mass Vitrify wall, and this will increase the damage your 2 does. This stacks endlessly, theoretically infinite damage. The amount of damage her 2 is increased by stacks of combo count and melee damage builds built for puncture or slash, depending on which variant of her 1 you use. Splinter Storm. Gara summons her shards of glass to protect her or allies, or even the objective, with 90% damage reduction until the ability is over. This is Gara's best ability, no questions asked. It gives damage reduction to Gara, her allies, and the objective, making her great at all things defense. This ability also has the aforementioned combo with her 1 and 4 to get quite literally stupid damage numbers, and on top of it you can simply cast her 4 to auto reset this monster of abilities duration, which means as long as you have enough energy for her 4, you have infinite damage and constant 90% damage reduction, making Gara nigh unkillable and able to obliterate anything in the game in seconds. Mending Splinters is Splinter Storm's augment. It gives her too the ability to heal yourself on top of its other effects, because this ability really needed added bonuses, right DE? Regardless, while helpful, it isn't even needed. Gara has more than enough survivability with her 2 alone, and if you get low enough to possibly die quickly, transference with Operator Arcanes and full health again, this isn't even close to needed, and is not worth the mod slot. Spectrarage. Gara summons a carousel of glass mirrors to trap enemies inside. This is Gara's worst ability, which makes it a free helmet slot, but even this isn't useless. It can work as a distraction, it just isn't necessary most of the time, and the damage it reflects to enemies isn't great, making it poor at DPS and CC, but it can be used as a distraction fairly well, but overall not great, and barely if ever casted. Spectra Siphon is Spectrarage's augment. It causes the enemies inside of the mirrors to have a 50% chance to drop an enemy energy orb. While this somewhat helps her with keeping her 2 up at all times, it isn't needed as Zeneric's mere existence and energy pads making it a waste of a mod slot. Mass Vitrify. Gara summons a wall of glass to defend an area. This is a wall of glass that can defend an area, usually being used for defense-based objective modes or to CC a large group of enemies, turning them to glass and completely immobilizing them. This is also used to build the immense damage of a 2 using the aforementioned combo. This is also used to reset the cooldown on Splinter Storm, while it is in use, allowing for near constant uptime. Steel Path. Gara performs amazingly in Steel Path due to her constant damage reduction, and speaking of dethroning Frost, has the best objective defense with her 4. She performs well in all other game modes, and has the ability to kill anything Steel Path can throw at her with the immense damage combo her 2 provides. This also makes her nigh unkillable due to the damage reduction, making her one hell of a tank. Her playstyle consists of keeping your 2 up at all times, and building the damage her 2 does over time with her 2-4-1 combo, starting by using her 2, then casting her 4, going outside of it, and then using your 1 on the wall, following this simply periodically use her 4 to reset the cooldown on her 2, and as long as you have energy, you have infinite damage, and at the same time a whopping 90% damage reduction. Helminth has a free slot in her 3 to play around with, some combos. A quicker CC could be helpful to her kit, although it wouldn't really be necessary due to her 2 being disgusting. Overall, a beast at everything Steel Path has to offer. Do you need damage? Her 2 has that covered. Damage reduction? Her 2 also covers that. How about group CC? Yep, she has that too with her 4. Do you for some reason need to distract a group of enemies? Her 3 can somewhat do that. And what about defending an area or a defense point? Her 4 covers all objective-based game modes without breaking a sweat. This frame is the be-all, end-all, jack of all trades. A+. Garuda, ability showcase, Dread Mirror. Garuda stabs an enemy and summons a mirror to shield herself from incoming damage. This is a survivability based ability where the mirror absorbs incoming projectile based damage, and has the adverse effect of when the ability button is held down, it rapidly drains Garuda's energy and creates a blood orb that gets charged until she runs out of energy, at which point she throws it, dealing massive damage to enemies in the affected area. Dread Warder's Dread Mirror's augment. It makes Garuda immortal for 5 seconds after Dread Mirror has killed an enemy. In theory, this is great. It gives a squishy frame immortality, but the keyword here is kill, which isn't likely to happen except in extremely low level content. Blood Altar. Garuda stabs an enemy onto an altar. This is a survivability based ability. The enemy on the altar leaks blood which heals Garuda when she is in the altar's vicinity, but this is extremely inconsistent and in high level content simply isn't good enough. Bloodforge's Blood Altar's augment. It reloads your weapon when Blood Altar is casted. What an amazing augment. 10 out of 10. Good job, D. But in all seriousness, reload speed has never been a serious issue worth modding for, and as such this augment is useless. Bloodletting. Garuda halves her energy for energy gain. Halves her health for energy gain. This is a debuff ability that cuts Garuda's health in half, at the benefit of adding to her energy meter. Seeking Talons. Garuda unleashes a storm of talons that seek out enemies. This is a multi-target DPS ability that inflicts a slash status effect upon impact. This can be charged to increase the radius of the original attack. This is undeniably her best ability, with its wide area of effect and decent damage, with a disappointing time to kill. This is helped by the fact that this ability scales off combo multiplier too, though. Blending Talons is Seeking Talons augment. It allows Garuda to tap the ability to use a base 9 meter range around herself, and allows it to build combo multiplier faster on enemies with a slash proc, making this great for building a combo count. Alas, this isn't difficult to do, so this augment isn't worth the slot. Steel Path. In Steel Path, Garuda performs extremely averagely, due to not having a great damage option, mediocre survivability, and non-existent CC, and while her 4 is great at AoE damage, its time to kill is abysmal, requiring a decent amount of time to kill anything, and because of the problem of Dread Mirror needing to be up at all times, she can't even use it for damage. And if she does, it still doesn't do enough anyway, as even with max energy you won't build up nearly enough damage to kill Steel Path enemies. Her overall playstyle consists of keeping her 1 up at all times, to reduce as much damage taken as possible, due to how frail she is, and then using your 4 to damage enemies. You then just wait for the slash proc to eventually kill the enemies, and move area by area doing this to kill the enemies. The downside is the horrible time to kill, making you wait a decent while to get kills, else you risk dying. And with her 2 being lackluster healing, this doesn't help her case either. To help her DPS combo is the fact her 3 gives Garuda unlimited energy, but also increases the chances of death, making her inherently high risk, high reward. But the risk is so much bigger than the reward in comparison to other frames that do so much better. She does benefit from the helmet system, and can gain a much needed CC tool, or even a survivability tool, to replace her inconsistent and lackluster 2. Overall, a very average frame, having the capacity to deal decent damage, and okay survivability, but requires a long time to kill, and an inherently risky playstyle. C. Gauss. Ability Showcase. Mac Rush. Gauss rushes forward with immense speed, knocking nearby enemies down. This is a movement-based ability. This is where Gauss's speed aspect comes into play. Rushing forward, dealing pitiful damage but okay CC. It is a great movement tool, but is rather difficult to use due to how the tile sets are laid out in comparison to free roam, where this ability is great in comparison. This is also used to charge Gauss's battery for his other abilities. Mac Crush is Mac Rush's augment. It sends out a vacuum behind the trail of the rush that sucks in enemies in range, CCing them. This is actually quite helpful and can help with grouping enemies together for his thermal sundal damage combo. This is a usable augment and can be viable in some builds. Kinetic Plating. Gauss envelops himself in armor powered by absorbed kinetic damage. This is a survivability and buff based ability that absorbs certain damage types and converts them to energy, the types being physical, heat, cold, and blast. This also gives him decent damage reduction, scaling based off the battery charge. It also prevents him from being knocked down and staggered. The energy provided is on a per hit basis, scaling up to 5% energy being gained per hit at max battery level. Thermal Sunder. Gauss creates a circle of energy absorbed from nearby kinetic energy. This is his main DPS tool, creating a circle of damage, either being cold or heat, depending on which version of the ability Gauss casted, by either tapping the ability button or holding it down. The DPS is quite decent, dealing a respectable amount of damage. This is also the main ability used to charge Gauss's battery. Redline. Gauss amps his battery to max, buffing a variety of stats. This is a buff ability that buffs the following attributes, these being fire rate, attack speed, reload speed, and holster speed. For his weapons, it also increases the damage of all of his abilities, deal and increases the damage reduction of his 2. It does, however, rapidly drain the battery of charge when casted, while its buff for his 3 gives it some armor strip potential and overall increased damage. Steel Path. Gauss performs decently in Steel Path, being able to traverse the map without issue and easily deal with the Steel Path enemies using his 3 and not struggling with survivability due to his 2. His main playstyle revolves around charging the battery and keeping his 2 up at all times. You keep your 2 up to have damage reduction for as long as possible, and periodically use your 3 to charge the battery, to eventually build his 4, and then use that to devastating effect to annihilate the surrounding enemies for its duration. He could benefit from the helmet system, with this one being a pretty much free remove, provided you don't care about its mobility, but all his kit flows well together, so it isn't needed. Overall, a great frame for damage with his 3, quick terrain traversal with his 1, and excellent survivability with his 2, and overall damage and weapon buffs with his 4. This frame can do it all, and do it well. A. Grendel, Ability Showcase. Feast. Grendel swallows a group of enemies whole, storing them in his stomach. This is a multi-target CC/DPS ability that also has armor strip potential when the enemies are inside of the stomach. This is great CC and damage, and can even be used to throw enemies off the map by holding down the ability button and spitting them out. This is also used to deal high burst damage. The problem is the high energy drain that increases depending on the amount of enemies swallowed. Nourish. Grendel envelops swallowed enemies in a toxin aura that buffs allies and heals himself. This is a buff ability that buffs various attributes, these being at any one time, self-heal nourished armor, strike, or energy. These can be cycled by holding the nourish button down. Self-heal heals Grendel whenever nourish is casted. Nourished armor causes the enemies to be inflicted by a toxin status effect when attacking Grendel. Nourished strike gives a base toxin damage buff to Grendel's melee attacks, and nourished energy gives a base energy gain to Grendel and allies. Hearty nourishment is Nourish's augment. It removes status effects when used and makes him immune to status for 2 seconds per each enemy in his stomach. This is quite helpful for removing debuffs and not worrying about them. The problem is Grendel doesn't really worry about them in the base, so it isn't a necessity for him. Regurgitate. Grendel spits out an enemy stored in his stomach. This is a single target DPS ability which involves Grendel spitting out an enemy violently to a location of his choosing. This can even be used to send enemies off the map. This ability does however require an enemy in Grendel's stomach. Pulverize. Grendel turns into his ball form and starts rolling around the area. This is a movement/DPS ability that deals pitiful damage and has 0 use as a movement ability. as you move at the speed of a snail, making it borderline useless, and as a result is rarely if ever casted. It does however have some niche CC use. This also requires an enemy to be in Grendel's stomach. Catapult is Pulverizer's augment. It allows for you to aim his Pulverize with either your mouse or joystick. This is quite bad, and it is just a little fun. It doesn't even address any of the ability's issues, and unless looking for a laugh, not worth the mod slot. Steel Path. Grendel performs decently in Steel Path, as if he really wants to. He can just eat everything and never have to kill them. And if there is any sort of gap in the map, he can just spit them out for a free kill. And as a result, can rather easily cheese missions for free. He has his buffs, which are okay, but Nourished Energy is the only one that gets casted really. And while you can use his 4, it doesn't really do anything, merely tickling enemies for poor damage. His playstyle consists of eating enemies with his 1 and then using his 2 to replenish energy, and either spitting them out or by holding 1 or launching them out of bounds with his 3. Helminth can benefit him due to his 4 being nearly useless and results in a free slot. But again, his kit flows very well together and doesn't need anything extra to help. Overall, a decent frame with decent survivability, just due to his health and armor, amazing CC and damage in his 1, okay burst with his 2, and a funny cheese gimmick with his 3, and a poor movement with his 4. B. Harrow. Ability Showcase. Condemn. Harrow summons forth chains to bind enemies. This is a multi-target CC and survivability ability that binds enemies in chains and gives Harrow added bonus shields to Harrow's already impressive shields. This is a great CC tool, allowing for Harrow to immobilize hordes of enemies to then swiftly mow them down with weapon damage. Tribunal is Condemn's augment. It allows for Harrow and allies to proc 50% of the effects of both Durable and Penance when attacking chained enemies, making Condemn even better and Penance more and more useless. This could help a support-oriented build or even a solo one without Penance, as Harrow's solo build genuinely use Helmet's abilities. Penance. Harrow sacrifices his shields to buff himself and heal himself and nearby allies. This is a debuff/buff ability that sacrifices Harrow's shields at the benefit of buffs to reload and fire rate and converting damage dealt to health for Harrow and nearby allies. This is a great buff to allies and himself, increasing survivability and buffing overall DPS. Thurible. Harrow spins his chain around, generating energy into it but sacrificing his own. This is a buff/debuff ability that sacrifices Harrow's energy for an area buff that bestows energy to Harrow and nearby enemies when killed, increasing the amount of energy received if the hit is a headshot. This is a great support tool, increasing energy gains and giving a constant stream of energy to himself and nearby allies. Warding Thurible is Thurible's augment. It grants additional energy gains and 40% damage reduction to allies and Harrow while Harrow is channeling Thurible. Which is the problem, as while Harrow is channeling, he has the buffs, but when he isn't, they disappear. That is the issue, and why this augment isn't worth using. Covenant. Harrow completes a ritual making himself and allies invulnerable to damage for a set time. This is a buff ability that makes Harrow and nearby allies immune to damage for the duration. Following this, depending on the amount of damage absorbed, Harrow and allies receive a net critical chance and weapon damage buff for the remaining duration. This is a great tool, as if you have an oh shit moment, you can quickly cast this and then gain a net buff, increasing DPS and your overall damage output. Last in Covenant, this allows for upon headshot, increase the crit buff duration for 3 seconds. This is great, giving you and your team a near constant crit buff as long as you're securing headshots, which isn't difficult, making this a somewhat usable augment. Steel Path. Harrow performs okay in Steel Path due to his 1. He can CC an entire area, meaning you're not likely to die, especially due to the amount of overshields gained from using his 1. And while his 2 can be casted, it's made pretty much irrelevant due to his 1's mere existence, and the fact that its buffs are pretty mediocre. His 3 is mainly used to gain energy to keep using his 1, making it a decent tool just to maintain energy. His 4 is only used if you are ever in trouble of dying and need a quick oh shit save me tool to get out of the situation, and due to the enemy's damage output, the buff is pretty substantial, allowing you to obliterate enemies in seconds. His playstyle consists of using his 3 to maintain your energy and then using his 1 to both CC enemies and grant him overshields, in turn increasing his survivability, and then in the event of a pinch, using your 4 to get away for a getaway free card. You could also just use his 4 at the start of an engagement to increase overall damage output, speeding up the time to kill. He can benefit from Helminth, as his 2 is unnecessary in general, but it does flow nicely in the event of needing a quick heal ability due to its lifesteal buff. Overall, the archetype of a support frame, able to do everything his team needs, but requires himself to do everything, which in this test format is great. And as a result, he does everything incredibly well, not struggling at all to build energy or overshields due to having no teammates around him. B+. Hildryn, Ability Showcase, Balefire. Hildryn charges her Balefire into a concentrated ball of energy and shooting it into an area dealing damage on impact. This is an AoE DPS ability that deals okay damage. This also applies a heat status effect to all targets in radius of the explosion. This is an okay DPS ability that is rarely used, can occasionally be used to CC with the widespread heat proc, but this isn't recommended. Balefire Surge is Balefire's augment. It allows for the Balefire to regain shields for Hildryn, which isn't great as Pillage does it so much faster and much better than this augment, making it a waste of a mod slot. Pillage. Hildryn absorbs armor and shields from surrounding enemies. This is an AoE survivability / debuff ability that sucks armor and shields from nearby enemies and applies them to Hildryn's own shields and armor. This is her best ability by a mile, and can make her an unstoppable tank with this ability up, giving her significant damage reduction and increased shields to the point of absurdity. This along with her 4 makes a lesser known mission type in Hijack irrelevant and easy. Blazing Pillage is Pillage's augment. It deals heat damage to enemies affected by the pillage and gains an additional 50 shields per enemy, which speeds up the shield recharge and slightly increases DPS, which is great, a usable augment for sure. Haven. Hildryn drains her shields to give added bonus shields to allies. This is an AoE debuff / buff ability. It strips Hildryn's shields but gives allies bonus overshields but does nothing for herself, and as a result is unnecessary. Shield drain in solo is unnecessary shield drain in solo based modes. Aegistorm. Hildryn hovers above ground and immobilizes nearby enemies. This is an AoE CC ability that immobilizes nearby enemies and damages them over time. This does however have the caveat of rapidly draining her shields. This is used with her exalted weapon Balefire charges, which do respectable damage. Steel Path. Hildryn performs decently in Steel Path due to her pillage making her nigh immortal, and has okay enough armor strip to where her 1 and 4's damage is enough to get by, especially with 4's CC aspect combined with the exalted weapon's damage. Her 3 is borderline never used, and if it is used, is to help shield gate rather than its intended effect of giving her overshields, as they are straight up just not needed to prevent her from dying. She's good enough at this without her overshields. Overall, her playstyle consists of keeping 4 up to CC an entire area, and using your exalted weapon to deal massive damage, and when in trouble or running low on shields you can pop her 2 to immediately regain the lost shields. You can cast your 1, but it's just some extra damage, which is pretty bad to be honest. Helmet does impact her, as Haven is a pretty much free helmet slot, as Haven kinda sucks, and even if it can gain overshields, it can be easily replaced with a better alternative. Overall, a great frame that is nigh unkillable, has great CC but lacks in the massive damage, causing her time to kill to be a little low for what we would like. B+. Hydroid. Ability Showcase. Tempest Barrage. Hydroid drops a barrage from the sky, damaging nearby enemies. This is an AoE DPS ability that does pitiful damage, and is rarely worth the cast, making this arguably his worst ability. Corroding Barrage is Tempest Barrage's augment. It applies a corrosive status effect to each enemy upon impact, stripping their armor. This is actually quite useful, and due to Hydroid's abilities being garbage anyway, you might as well use that with gun damage to clear content, so I'd recommend using this augment. Tidal Surge. Hydroid transforms into a wave, speeding across the map with decent speed. This is a movement based ability that is decent for movement, but its lesser CC aspect is unless you can knock enemies off the map. Tidal Impunity is Tidal Surge's augment. It removes status effects from Hydroid and allies and makes them immune to status effects and procs for 6 seconds, which isn't awful and can give survivability, but there are just strictly better options that don't sacrifice a mod slot for a better effect. Undertow. Hydroid transforms into a puddle, sending out a tentacle to drag enemies into it. This is a single target DPS ability in which Hydroid can drag enemies under, slowly drowning them. However, the DPS this does is abysmal, making it really only helpful to become vulnerable to damage. Curative Undertow is Undertow's augment. It allows allies to heal 30% of their health when inside the puddle, which is great for support-based Hydroid, but does nothing for Hydroid himself, and as a result, is useless. Tentacle Swarm. Hydroid summons a Kraken to attack nearby enemies. This is an AoE DPS ability that deals barely any damage, and is really only ever used in lower levels to farm by using its augment. Speaking of which, Pilfering Swarm is Tentacle Swarm's augment. It gives enemies an added chance to drop extra loot, Wow, amazing! It's not like a much better frame has a much better ability with the same effect and can actually kill decently modded enemies. Oh wait, there is? Unlucky Hydroid. But if you do still want to use this, it's a base loot bonus which is helpful for resource farms, so by all means run it, even if Khora is strictly better in every way, shape or form. Steel Path. Hydra performs horribly in Steel Path due to a severe lack of both DPS and decent CC, as well as a worrying lack of survivability outside of his 3. As a result, his 3 becomes his best ability, relying on it for any sort of damage, and even then the time to kill it has is abysmal. His 1 is never casted and is the equivalent to tickling the enemies, and has no other major effect outside of a bad armor strip augment. This 2 can cheese enemies off the map and is actually quite good at quick map traversal, but lackluster otherwise. His 4 is made redundant as it has no scaling damage, and as a result works as a glorified inconsistent CC ability that is easily outclassed in this field. As a frame that desperately needs a good ability, you have a large variety of helmet options to use on him, benefiting greatly from nearly any ability. Overall, a horrible frame in the current state of the game, lacking anything of use. The only thing keeping him out of the D tier is his Pilfering Swarm, still being decent at farming, but even that is getting outclassed now. Hydroid is screaming for a rework at this point, C-. Inaros, ability showcase, Desiccation. Inaros throws sand at nearby enemies, blinding them for a decent duration. This is an AoE CC ability and is also Inaros' bread and butter ability, allowing him to be the go-to frame for any melee combat and have no issue with survivability, as if you get low, use this and then commit a finisher and boom! Health. This makes the mummy borderline immortal and allows him to trivialize everything the game can throw at him. Desiccation's Curse is Desiccation's Augment. After a finisher attack, it has a 75% chance to summon a Sand Shadow that does nothing but act as a niche aggro sponge, and Inaros doesn't even need to aggro sponge, so it makes this augment irrelevant because he is a natural tank. Devour. Inaros begins eating a sanded target, healing himself. This is a single target DPS slash survivability ability that deals pitiful damage, but works nicely as a survival tool as you are literally immortal when using this ability, so it makes up for the severe lack of DPS. This also creates a sand shadow which is useless outside of a niche aggro sponge. Sandstorm. Inara spins around knocking enemies away. This is an AoE CC ability, however this does pitiful damage and as a result is never used, making for a free helmet slot on an already broken frame with next to no weaknesses, which gives him endless variety for ability options. Elemental Sandstorm and Sandstorm's Augment, it essentially just acts as a Zephyr Tornado, and that's it. It can give Inaros an ability based damage ability, so it can be helpful for some added DPS, definitely usable, and a huge upgrade on the base ability. Scarab Swarm. Inaros envelops himself in an armor of scarabs. This is a buff slash DPS ability that does pitiful damage to enemies, but gives a base 100% armor buff, and also gives near constant lifesteal for Inaros and allies, resulting in even more ridiculous survivability options for the mummy, who is already the king of survivability. Negation Swarm is Scarab Swarm's augment. It negates all status effects when cast at the cost of 3% of the bonus armor, which is easily replaced in a second, making it a decent usable augment. Steel Path. Surprising no one, Inaros annihilates everything and anything in Steel Path. It's almost like an immortal mummy with survivability up the wazoo, and a free finisher damage is kinda broken. Who would have thought? His 1 is his main ability being casted whenever you need any health. Press 1 finisher damage and you're fine again. And because he can farm finishers so easily, he can easily clear content without issue. His 2 is honestly kinda redundant because of the effect his 1 has, but if you ever get low enough you can use his 2 to stay completely immortal while feasting, allowing Inaros to fully heal with no downside whatsoever. His 3 can be casted to knock enemies away, it just kinda sucks to be honest, and as a result is never casted and makes for the freest helmet slot ever. His 4 is casted whenever you need more survivability for whatever reason, or if you want to give allies constant lifesteal, but for Inaros it isn't even needed. His playstyle consists of using your 4 at the start to give himself a base 100% armor buff, and then using his 1 to blind and kill enemies with finishers and heal at the same time, occasionally using his 2 and 3 if you really want, but it isn't at all necessary. Overall, this mummy is unstoppable at the moment, and he does everything you need him to damage. Check. CC. Check. Immeasurable immortality. Check. He has it all, and as a bonus couldn't give 2 less fucks about nullifiers. Barely any frames come close to touching this mummy. S. Ivara. Ability Showcase. Quiver. Ivara chooses one of 4 arrows to shoot out at an area, enveloping the area in an effect. These being Cloak. Ivara shoots a cloak arrow at the surface and any allies nearby become invisible for the ability's duration. This is a buff ability and a great one, having sustained invisibility, allowing you to attack enemies safely and without issue, easily allowing for quick and seamless room clearing. Dash wire. Ivara shoots out a dash wire arrow at a surface, a wire comes out, allowing her to latch onto it. This is a movement ability, allowing her to traverse the map uniquely, and as a result, get to some pretty decent areas of vantage, but is still a lackluster movement ability, and her worst arrow by a decent margin. Noise. Ivara shoots a sound arrow at a surface that attracts enemies to its location. This is a CC ability that crowds enemies into one area, allowing for a seamless one-shot and easy clearing for the area on paper, but in reality it is quite inconsistent as a CC. Sleep. Ivara shoots a sleep arrow at a surface and any enemies in its radius fall asleep for a set duration. This is a CC ability that is a much better alternative to Noise Arrow and is a lot more consistent as a CC and just a better CC as it also immobilizes them. This can be used in tandem with her Noise Arrow to create a kill zone. Empowered Quiver is Quiver's augment, giving her Cloak Arrow a negation of status effects, which is kinda redundant as you're invisible, and gives Dash Wire a critical damage buff, which is pretty nice, apart from Dash Wire being kind of obnoxious to use. It's usable, just one effect is redundant and the other is a pain to use effectively. Navigator. Ivara assumes control of a fired projectile, controlling its trajectory and path. This is a DPS ability, allowing for Ivara to control a shot on an enemy's crit spot or a further away target, or even to stop a miss shot from missing in the first place, with a slight damage buff. While on paper this seems decent, in reality it's quite lackluster, even when used with the Artemis bow, as missed attacks are usually too quick to control anyway, and the time taken to navigate it isn't really worth it in the long run. This also can act as a free helmet slot if desired. Piercing Navigator is Navigator's augment. It allows for the projectile being controlled to pierce through enemies, granting additional crit chance up to 50% and buffing its punch through, which while good, doesn't help the fact that Navigator just isn't used. Prowl. Ivara becomes invisible. This is a survivability / buff ability that causes Ivara to become invisible with greatly reduced mobility until she runs out of energy. This also has the adverse effect of letting Ivara pickpocket enemies for extra loot, which is irrelevant in most farms to be honest. Its other effect is buffing the damage of her exalted weapon Artemis bow, which is great as the damage buff, but is really helpful to increase DPS. Infiltrate is Prowl's augment. It allows Ivara to bypass lasers and move faster in Prowl, which is great for Spy and a minor mobility increase for normal gameplay. Overall great for Spy, but in general. Artemis bow. Ivara draws her exalted bow. This is a single target damage weapon that when fired deals incredible damage to enemies and can pierce through enemies. Concentrated arrow is Artemis bow's augment. It applies a single arrow with 50% added crit chance on headshot and an additional splash damage effect around the impacted area. This does however remove its pierce effect completely. Steel Path. Ivara performs well in Steel Path content as she can't be killed due to her 3, and part of her 1 has nearly unlimited CC options in her 1, and has an amazing exalted weapon in her 4, and a rather bad damage buff in her 2. Her 1 is used to CC enemies, or to get even more invisibility if you need it for some reason. Her 2 is near enough never used, and as a result is a free helmet ability. Her 3 is great, the only problem being its lack of mobility, and while you can roll, it still isn't great. You can pickpocket enemies, but you don't really farm Steel Path anyway, its main use is buffing the damage of her 4. Her 4 is casted whenever you need immense damage to kill a group of enemies. Her playstyle revolves around keeping her 3 and 4 up at all times to use the general damage, and using her 1 whenever you need CC, and never using her 2. Overall, a great jack of all trades and the queen of Spy, making her an invaluable asset to your arsenal, as she has great CC, amazing damage, and great survivability. Khora. Ability Showcase. Whip Claw. Khora draws her whip and strikes enemies with it. This is an AoE DPS ability. It deals great damage and is where Khora's immense damage comes from. This ability combined with a decent stat stick melee and a high combo count can end up amounting to some absurd damage numbers. Accumulating Whip Claw is Whip Claw's augment. It increases the damage her 1 does when 3 or more enemies are hit by the Whip Claw by a staggering 35%. And that stacks per Whip Claw, making it an amazing damage combo with her 2 and 1 combined. That with a stat stick and a higher combo count, and Khora's already insane damage can be increased even more. Even with the fact that the buff depletes after 10 seconds, it's very easy to get again with no drawback, and that makes her an amazing augment and should definitely be used in claw based builds. Ensnare. Khora reels in enemies to an affected target. This is Khora's main CC tool and is great, acting as a quick tool to crowd groups of enemies together with and then use it in combination with her 1 for immense damage. As insane as it is, it also gives a damage bonus against enemies in the ability. This is an amazing CC tool, and with Khora's already incredible damage, equates to some absolutely mind-boggling damage in easy mode clear. Venari. Khora calls upon her Kavat partner to assist her. This is a buff ability that has 1 of 3 effects, these being attack. In this posture, Venari attacks nearby enemies with a ferocious, furious swipes, and also used as a miniature version of Ensnare, locking enemies in place and applying a slash proc. This does okay damage, but has a low time to kill due to most of the damage coming from the slash proc instead of the attack itself. A decent posture. Protect. In this posture, Venari protects herself or Khora from nearby enemies, knocking them down and permanently disarming them with their weapon, making for an okay added CC tool that only has a 30-second cooldown. However, overall, probably the weakest posture. Heal. In this mode, Venari heals herself and Khora by 50 health per second, making it an effective survivability tool. This also has an aura-based effect which allows Venari to heal allies as well as Khora. It will also automatically heal the lowest health ally nearby. This is probably Venari's best posture depending on playstyle. If you want, or you can run attack majority of the time and switch to heal when low, or alternatively when playing safer, only run heal. Venari Bodyguard is Venari's augment. It makes Venari die in place of Khora whenever she is about to die, essentially giving a Khora a free life, and simply killing enemies lowers the timer to get her back in no time, makes her a decent augment to help with the survivability. A very usable augment and can be used to with tank-based builds to reduce the chance of dying drastically. Strangle Dome. Khora whips the dome to ensure nearby enemies are ensnared. This is a CC ability that has slightly more range and maximum targets than her 2. This makes her a great CC, and like her 2, also makes enemies more susceptible to damage while ensnared by the dome, and gives an added damage buff to Whip Claw, and allows it to damage all enemies in the dome at once. Pilfering Strangledome is Strangledome's augment. This gives enemies an added chance to drop loot, making it for a decent farming tool and a direct upgrade on Pilfering Swarm, as the enemies don't have to be killed by the ability, merely be inside of it, making it a great augment for farming. Steel Path. Khora performs near perfectly in Steel Path due to having immense damage capable of wiping out hordes of enemies in seconds, and incredible CC that can immobilize entire enemy areas effortlessly. Her 1 is mainly used for damage after her 2 is used to CC enemies into a tight area to maximize the damage of her 1. This does require a high combo count for its immense damage, however. Her 2 is used to CC an area and crowd enemies into an area to then one-shot them with her 1. Her 3 is best used in either attack or heal posture, but can be interchanged based on what is happening in the moment. Either works with 1 slightly increasing DPS, while the other gives her some added survivability. Her 4 is used when needing to lock down an area. This is most commonly used for excavation while defending multiple sites at a time, and completely locking down that area with no effort. This frame is so good, Helmet isn't even required here. It would just replace an already great synergy that her kit has, covering nearly all options a frame will ever need. Overall, an amazing frame that has immense damage in her 1, incredible CC in her 2, great survivability and utility in her 3, and even large area lockdown in her 4, which can also be used to defend objectives, an easy A+. Lavos, non-applicable, as I can't be asked to farm the materials due to the Cambion Drift being extremely annoying to farm materials in, and overall just a really boring overworld, period. Limbo, ability showcase, Banish. Limbo banishes an enemy to the rift. This is a single target CC. I guess it puts a single target into the rift, making them immortal unless Limbo himself is in the rift, which does mean you can just put everyone in the rift and never kill anything, but that isn't exactly fun now, is it? Rift Haven is Banish's augment. It heals allies by 25% of their max health when banished. And with the numerous ways to heal, this is just never going to get used, and does nothing to benefit Limbo. Not a great augment. Stasis. Limbo freezes time inside the rift domain. This is an AoE CC ability that freezes all targets in the rift, completely immobilizing them. This is the sole reason why Limbo is still even somewhat relevant, as he is the king of CC with this and his 4, making for a large area lockdown. But even this is starting to show its age, as at this point it's getting out CC'd by other abilities. Rift Surge. Limbo applies an effect to an enemy inside the rift. When killed, it spreads to enemies outside the rift. This is an AoE CC ability that is designed to get a lot of enemies into the rift and deal some negligible damage at the same time. The problem is his 4 does this on a bigger scale and for longer, and combines much better with stasis than this. And while this does some damage, it's just not relevant at all, and as it does so little. Rift Torrent is Rift Surge's augment. It increases the damage Limbo deals to enemies outside the rift by 30%. This was really close to being a good augment. All they had to do was increase damage dealt to enemies inside the rift, and it would have been a helpful damage tool. But instead, it slightly increases the damage Surge does to enemies when bringing them into the rift. The problem is Limbo does everything in the rift, so this makes it useless and not a great augment. Cataclysm. Limbo creates a globe of rift energy, drawing any enemy into the rift. This is an AoE CC ability. This is normally used to protect the objectives or zone a massive area in combination with his 2. And this ability combo is why he's the king of objective game modes and being nigh untouchable in mobile defense. But Gara can easily surpass him in damage and defense, only really struggling to CC, which is all Limbo has going for him at this point, with no DPS at all and no utility, which isn't even enough anymore, especially for solo gameplay, and even more so against nullifiers. If any centimeter of this bubble hits his 4, he is a dead man in seconds. Cataclysm Continuum is Cataclysm's augment. It increases the duration of Cataclysm by 1 second per enemy killed, making for an infinite CC tool when combined with his 2, and can actually help him as you have a lot longer to kill enemies and CC them for longer periods of time, and at a bigger radius. An okay augment that can definitely be used. Still Path. Limbo performs poorly to no one's surprise, and while you can just run around in Void and be completely unkillable, and use your 2 and 4 combo to CC, when you need to kill enemies, it's impractical, when there are far better frames that do it much better and have much higher damage potential. His 1 is straight up never casted, and has no useful effect at all really. His 2 is his best CC ability and is the only reason he can even clear content relying on gun damage. His 3 is a worthless excuse of an ability that does next to no damage, and is just a worse version of his 4 at a smaller range. His 4 is his best ability when combined with his 2, making for a great CC combo, locking down a large area, and makes you immortal really. But you have to use gun damage to mob clear instead of ability damage, as Limbo doesn't have any, period. His playstyle consists of dashing and staying in the rift until you get to the point of interest, at which you pop your 4 and 2 to immobilize nearby enemies and kill them with your weapons, rinse and repeat. Helmet doesn't even really benefit him, as he is just needing damage and doesn't require survivability at all, so there are a few options, but none of them are amazing to say the least. Overall, an okay frame who is all CC and nothing else, and while you are pretty much unkillable, it doesn't even matter, as 1 nully and you're dead regardless. C+. Loki, ability showcase. Decoy. Loki summons a decoy to distract enemies. This is a distraction based ability that Loki summons to distract enemies or to sponge aggro to allow Loki to kill them undetected. But this is kinda useless due to his general stealth ability being great without the need of an aggro sponge. This can also be used quite effectively to teleport through lasers in combination with his 3 and spy missions, and can finish them much quicker than Ivara as a result. Save Your Decoy is Decoy's augment. Its effect is whenever Loki would have taken fatal damage, his decoy will take it instead, making for a free extra life. This also increases the casting speed of Decoy, which is really niche and not that helpful. It also teleports Loki away from danger. This is a helpful augment, but the likelihood of dying with Invis existing is really low, so it defeats Loki's best attribute. Invisibility. Loki becomes invisible to enemies. This is a buff ability. This is indisputably his best ability, and is the main reason he can clear content. This does require him to use weapon damage, as he has no damage in his kit. This also is what makes him the king of spy, due to not being seen by cameras, and having the longest duration invisibility with decent mobility. Hushed invisibility is invisibility's augment. It silences all gun sounds, having the niche use of focus farming, but not much outside of that, making for a bad niche augment. Switch teleport. Loki swaps places with an enemy, ally, or his decoy. This is a mobility-based ability, allowing for Loki to traverse distances slightly quicker, and to bypass lasers when used in tandem with his 1. But outside of that, this is mainly used as a troll ability, switch teleporting a teammate off the map, or outside an elevator. This can also be used to steal dodges into planes, if you want to do that. Safeguard Switch. This makes an ally swapped with invincibility for 6 seconds, helpful for use of decoy to make an invulnerable damage sponge, but still not great, and a rather lackluster augment. Radial Disarm. Loki sends out a wave disarming nearby enemies. This is an AoE CC ability that disarms enemies with their weapons. This used to be his other saving grace, but over time this has become more and more irrelevant, with far better CC options on better frames, and then as a result, Loki has become his 2 with occasional use of his 1 and 3. In Spy, and occasional use of his 4. Irradiating Disarm is Radial Disarm's augment. It adds the radiation proc to enemies disarmed, which deals some niche damage on top of the CC, which is helpful, and probably his best augment and form out of DPS outside of stealth finishes. Steel Path. Loki performs alright in every mission type except for Spy, in which he excels, easily outpacing an Ivara in regards to completing the tile sets quickly. But in other game modes, he has become Invisibility the Warframe, rarely using anything but his 2, and while you can cast his 1 and 4, they don't really do anything, and his 3 is borderline useless. His 1 is only ever used as a distraction or an aggro sponge, his 2 is constantly used and is the only way he can effectively clear content with the combination of his 2 and strong weapon damage. His 3 is effectively useless and a troll ability with 0 actual value to it, and his 4 is a mediocre CC that while it can be used is just outclassed by pretty much every CC at this point. His main playstyle is effectively press 2 and shoot, and occasionally cast 1 and 4 if you need a distraction or some mediocre CC. Loki can benefit from the helmet system, as he can obtain some form of damage or an added CC to assist him along with his 2. Overall, Loki has become 2 the Warframe, with 2 mediocre abilities and 1 meme one, and with the no damage potential limited CC but great survivability. The only reason he's above C is because of how good his invisibility is. But if you like Spy, he is the unrivaled King of Spy. C+. Mag. Ability Showcase. Pull. Mag pulls enemies towards her. This is a multi-target CC ability that pulls enemies to and behind Mag's current location. This is actually quite a decent CC, able to misplace enemies from areas and effectively make it impossible for enemies to get to an area. This can also be used to pull enemies off the map for easy cheese kills. Greedy Pull is Pull's augment. It allows you to pull pickups towards you, which is helpful on loot frames, and Mag isn't one, so niche augment for Mag. Magnetize. Mag creates a sphere of magnetic energy, trapping enemies inside, or Mag creates a magnetic field around herself, redirecting enemies' attacks back at them with devastating force. This is an AoE CC/DPS ability that creates a sphere that reflects damage sent into it into enemies trapped inside. You can also shoot your own weapons into the sphere to damage them, which amplifies the damage dealt to the enemies as well. This is Mag's main damage source. Combining this with her 3 and a decent AoE damage weapon can create a sphere of immense damage. Its other effect is a protective field around you, absorbing damage dealt and then storing it before releasing it when the ability ends or is pressed again. Magnetized Discharge is Magnetize's augment. It allows you to detonate the Magnetized bubble for extra damage and also increase the range of Magnetize. The added burst damage isn't really needed, but the range buff is nice and is quite helpful for making for a decent augment. Polarize. Mag sends out a wave that damages and depletes enemy shields and armor. It also creates shards that are used in combination with her 2 to deal damage. This is an AoE buff/debuff/DPS ability that depletes shields and strips armor, as well as comboing with her 2 for a damage combo. This is a decent debuff and an okay armor strip, which can increase Mag's time to kill significantly, and the damage it deals with her 2 and a decent weapon can reach mind-boggling numbers, making it her best form with DPS. When allies are hit by the wave, their shields are restored, resulting in a decent support ability. Counterpulse is Polarizer's augment. It jams enemy weapons and destroys cameras and disables robotics, making for some extra utility on top of its other effects, and some added survivability with the weapon jam, which is quite helpful, but sacrificing a mod slot for this isn't really worth it. A decent augment to be sure though. Crush. Mag crushes enemies in her vicinity. This is an AoE DPS ability that deals okay damage, and has the added effect of displacing nearby enemies. This can also be used to combo with her 2 and 3's combo to deal a lot of damage to the original target of the ability, as her 2 increases her 4's damage. This makes for a decent DPS ability when used in tandem with her 2 and 3 to create a kill zone for any enemy that comes close to your 2. You can also use your 1 to pull them into range for this combo. Fracture and Crush. This is Crush's augment. It armor strips serving any enemies that are targeted by the original ability and CCs them for 7 seconds, making for an okay armor strip and CC tool. Probably Mag's best augment purely for the armor strip, but still not worth the mod slot for it. Steel Path. Mag performs surprisingly well on Steel Path, especially compared to what I remember her DPS capabilities being. She really can hang with the best at this point, especially in terms of raw DPS. This is due to her 2, 3 and 4 combining to deal immense damage and have excellent CC on top of that. This makes for an amazing frame, and with the added armor strip and debuff of her 3, and the fact that it restores your shields, also giving you survivability, and further combining that with her 1, bringing anything in range of her death combo, makes her a devastating combo. Her 1 is mainly used to bring enemies into range of your kill zone of her 2, 3 and 4, or to cheese stronger enemies off the map. Her 2 is her main DPS ability and also has CC aspects. This is cast with her 3 and 4 to create her incredible damage combo, and swiftly kill any weak enemy, especially with any decent AoE weapon. Her 3 buffs her 2's damage, and is mainly casted with that or to armor strip nearby enemies and to restore your own shields, giving her survivability and helpful utility. Her 4 is mainly used with her 2 to deal a quick burst of damage to insta-kill something, as Mag's time to kill isn't great. Her playstyle consists of using your 1 to pull enemies into range of her death combo of her 2 and 3, combined with an AoE weapon, while her 2 and 3 are both used for this combo, with her 3 also used to armor strip and restore shields, giving her some form of survivability, and using her 4 purely for a quick efficient burst damage. She doesn't need or benefit from helmets, as she has 4 solid abilities that synergize well. Overall, a massive upgrade after I discovered the sheer amount of damage this frame has, and combine that with the utility and survivability her 3 gives her, and combine that further with solid DPS and CC in her 2, and the decent burst damage in her 4, and you have an amazing frame. Mesa. Ability Showcase. Ballistic Battery. Mesa charges her weapon with damage from her other weapons. This is a single target DPS ability that deals the charge damage to an enemy in range. This is a pretty poor ability, purely due to the fact that this doesn't do bonus damage, and as a result scales horribly, and is even worse when considering the amount of damage stored isn't infinite, making it useless as a burst damage tool as well. This makes it easily the worst of her abilities, but as a plus side does make it the freest helmet slot in existence. Ballistic Bullseye is Ballistic Battery's augment. It applies 100% status chance depending on the amount of damage dealt. This would be great if this ability scaled higher than 1400 damage, which it doesn't, and makes this augment useless. Shooting Gallery. Mesa summons an aura around herself that disarms enemies of their weapons and buffs weapon damage. This is an AoE buff/debuff ability that disarms enemies on top of giving her weapons a damage buff. This is a great ability, giving her both utility and survivability, and a very helpful damage buff that also works with her 4, which can create some insane damage numbers. Muzzle Flash's Shooting Gallery's augment. It causes an AoE blind whenever a teammate gains the bonuses helpful as utility, but does nothing for Mesa herself, making a niche augment. Shatter Shield. Mesa envelops herself in reflective armor. This is a buff/survivability ability that decreases damage dealt to Mesa, and reflects it back at her assailants. This can go up to a whopping 90% damage reduction, making Mesa extremely difficult to kill, especially combined with her 2's disarm effect, which makes for some great survivability and means that Mesa isn't a glass cannon and can take some considerable punishment of her own. Staggering Shield is Shatter Shield's augment. It causes reflective bullets to have a chance of staggering enemies. This is quite helpful and gives us some CCC, but a helmet ability can do this without a mod slot and makes this augment pointless really. Peacemaker. Mesa draws her regulators, shooting nearby enemies. This is an AoE DPS ability where Mesa shoots nearby enemies, dealing immense damage. This is an amazing DPS ability, and with her 2 can create absurd damage, and is the main reason why Mesa can mob clear with no effort, and has some of the highest scaling damage in the entire game. As said before, her damage scales the longer you shoot an enemy for, which increases her DPS considerably at the cost of higher energy drain. But this isn't really a problem, with energy drain being irrelevant in almost all content at this point. Mesa's Waltz is Peacemaker's augment, allowing Mesa to walk while in her 4, which can circumvent the lack of range, making this her best augment, as it improves one of her abilities, a definitely usable augment. Steel Path. Mesa is an absolute machine in Steel Path, with immense damage from her 4 and the ability to buff it with her 2, on top of disarming enemies for survivability, and then combining that with a 90% damage reduction of her 3 makes her a scarily effective combo. Her 1 is straight up never casted and is a useless ability. Her 2 is used all the time, along with her 4 to buff the damage and disarm enemies in range. Her 3 is used to give her considerable damage reduction and removes the fragility that she normally has, allowing her to frontline easily. Her 4 is her bread and butter and the cause of her insane damage potential, and due to it having scaling damage, this can go even higher, making for near insta-kills of nearly any enemy type in the game. Her playstyle consists of popping her 2, 3 and 4 constantly, using her 2 to start an engagement by removing weapons from the equation, and buffing the damage of her 4, then using her 3 to proc the 90% damage reduction, making her one hell of a damage sponge, and then finally finishing with her 4, wiping the entire room in seconds. Mesa can benefit quite well from the helmet system due to her 1 being borderline useless, and any helmet ability is an improvement on it. Overall, this gunslinger is a force to be reckoned with. Great survivability and utility in her 2, amazing damage reduction in her 3, and absurd damage scaling in her 4 with decent range. Her only weakness is the limited range of her 4, but this is extremely easy to work around and the best of the best as far as DPS is concerned, and is far from fragile. S. Mirage. Ability showcased. Hall of Mirrors. Mirage summons clones to use her equipped weapon. This is an AoE buff ability that increases weapon damage dealt by Mirage, increasing her DPS tenfold, making for a decent damage buff, and when combined with a decent AoE spread weapon, such as an Ignis Wraith, it can create some absurd mold clearing ability. Hall of Malevolence is Hall of Mirrors Augment. It buffs the damage dealt by your clones by 5%, stacking up to 50% bonus damage every time you kill an enemy, giving Mirage some amazing scaling damage, and is an invaluable asset to have, making this a great augment and worth the onslaught just for that scaling damage. Sleight of Hand. Mirage places down a trap that explodes when enemies are in the vicinity. This is an AoE DPS/CC ability that explodes in the light, damaging enemies in the vicinity, or blinds enemies in the dark. This is a pretty poor damage ability, or an OK CC ability, but still inconsistent to make it useful, making for a bad ability in general, but is Mirage's free helmet slot. Explosive Ledger Domain is Sleight of Hand's augment. It applies an added 250 damage to the explosion, and has a 60% chance to proc status. This is still quite bad, as she needs CC, not a slight DPS increase, making this augment useless. Eclipse. Mirage envelops herself in an aura that changes based on the light of the area. This is a buff ability that has one of 2 effects. These being in bright areas, a net damage buff which can scale quite high when combined with her 1, or a net 75% damage reduction when in dark areas. These are both great effects, and her bright effect in particular is really good, combining with her 1 for some great damage, and the damage reduction is no slouch either, giving her some desperately needed survivability. Total Eclipse is Eclipse's augment. It applies the Eclipse buff to nearby anime and allies, which does nothing for Mirage, and Mirage isn't great at supporting anyway, making this augment niche and only helpful for support-based builds. Prism. Mirage summons a prism that sprays out beams of light, damaging nearby enemies. This is an AoE DPS ability that damages enemies with beams of light coming from the prism. This is an okay DPS ability, but far from the immense damage it used to possess, and a shadow of its former self as a result. This damage is increased if Mirage is standing in a light area and when casted, and when the prism ends after casting. Prism Guard is Prism's augment. It causes the prism to follow above Mirage for 4 seconds and damages nearby enemies. Unfortunately, it doesn't increase the damage it deals or give it bonus effects, making it fun but not useful. Steel Path. Mirage performs decently in Steel Path, mainly being carried by the damage of her 1 and 3 combined with the AoE damage of her 4. Makes her some decent damage, but a lack of consistent survivability outside of her 3, which relies on light levels. Her 1 is her main ability, being up at all times as a consistent damage buff to any weapon. Her 2 can be used to CC for some slight DPS, but the CC effect is much better. The problem comes with it being extremely inconsistent. Her 3 is another net damage buff with the other benefit of occasional damage reduction, but like everything to do with light levels, it too is extremely inconsistent and not a reliable survivability tool. While her 4 is a decent AoE DPS ability that increases overall DPS, it too has the issue of lack of consistency due to its damage getting reduced in low light levels. Mirage can benefit from the helmet system, preferably with either a consistent CC or survivability tool. Overall, a decent DPS frame that just needs some extra CC and consistent survivability to bump her up to the next level. But right now, the Prankster is sitting at a B. Nekros, ability showcase. Soul Punch. Nekros punches enemies, sending them flying. This is a single target DPS/CC ability that does mediocre damage and knocks enemies away. This is a poor DPS ability with some niche use as a CC tool, but overall a bad ability. Soul Survivor is Soul Punch's augment. It allows Nekros to instantly revive a down teammate when using this ability on them. This doesn't help Nekros himself, and doesn't fix any of the issues with this ability, making it bad and quite mediocre as a support augment. Terrify. Nekros screeches at nearby enemies, scaring them away. This is an AoE CC ability that forces enemies to flee in fear, which somewhat works as a get off me tool, but its secondary effect of armor stripping is a non-factor, as it's such a bad armor strip. This is an okay CC, but really only acts as a get away from me tool, and doesn't do much to crowd enemies into an area like a normal CC. Creep and Terrify is Terrify's augment. It slows enemies down by 60% of their movement speed, but why would you sacrifice a mod slot when Nova does it better, with far less effort? Desecrate. Nekros disintegrates dead bodies into extra loot. This is an AoE utility ability that's sole purpose is to gain more loot, and has no other effect. This is a great ability and the sole reason why Nekros is used, really mainly due to his other abilities being lackluster, and still the only thing Nekros is good at is farming, giving him the nickname Loot Daddy in the community. Despoils Desecrate's augment. It causes Desecrate to use Nekros' health rather than his energy for the bodies, and synergizes well with Equilibrium. Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything to help Nekros' flaws, making it a good farming augment, but bad elsewhere. Shadows of the Dead. Nekros summons dead enemies to fight for him. This is an AoE utility ability that has some DPS capabilities, and with the changes to his 4 actually giving him some form of DPS now, makes him not completely worthless, but still miles below most frames in terms of raw DPS. But even with the DPS, the shadows still act as a glorified distraction, and that's it. Shield of Shadows is Shadows of the Dead's augment. It causes the shadows to take 6% of the damage that Nekros would have taken, which gives him some desperately needed survivability, and why it is only helpful augment for non-farming purposes, it's still quite bad in general. Steel Path. Nekros in overall terms performs horrifically due to the severe lack of DPS and being so fragile to the point of getting one-shot by nearly anything in Steel Path can throw at him. His 1 is completely useless with the exception of cheesing an enemy off the map, but other than that has 0 damage potential. His 2 is a CC that doesn't group enemies together and instead acts as a get away from me tool when he's in danger. His 3 is really the only thing saving him from irrelevancy and does nothing to help him his weaknesses as a frame. His 4 has some form of DPS, but it is not good enough for Steel Path, and really only acts as distraction/aggro sponge. His playstyle consists of keeping his 3 up constantly and periodically using your 4 to distract enemies and then using weapon damage to clear areas. He can also use his 2 to scare enemies off if he is in trouble, but it just doesn't do much. The helmet system can benefit him in pretty much any way you want, as near enough any ability massively improves his kit. Overall, Loot Daddy is exactly that and has no other great ability and relies on gun damage to clear content, and the sole reason he's above D is because of Desecrate and his status as the game's Loot Daddy. C-. Nezha, ability showcase. Firewalker. Nezha envelops his feet in fire and runs leaving a flaming trail. This is a movement/DPS ability that leaves a flaming trail that damages enemies and gives a marginal buff to his sprint speed. This does negligible damage, but the sprint speed buff combined with his passive gives him decent map traversal. This is still, however, his worst ability. Pyroclastic Flow is Firewalker's augment. It stores the damage dealt with Firewalker and then unleashes a trail of 150% damage at the enemy, making it an okay augment. Blazing Chakram. Nezha throws his Chakram, igniting enemies upon impact and making them more susceptible to damage. This is an AoE debuff/DPS ability that makes enemies take more damage and damages them itself with a heat proc. This actually does quite decent damage at full charge and increases all forms of damage the enemies take, including from weapon damage, which makes this an invaluable asset for Nezha and his team and his second most ability. Reaping Chakram, this applies a 2 times damage multiplier per enemy hit, and also causes enemies to have a chance of dropping health orbs. This is an amazing augment, giving Nezha even more damage and some added utility. This makes it by far his best augment, and with the scaling damage can insta-kill a lot of enemies. A great addition to your build, and definitely worth the mod slot. Warding Halo. Nezha envelops himself in his halo, absorbing all damage dealt to him. This is a survivability ability that absorbs all damage dealt to Nezha without a downside. This allows Nezha to tank any forms of damage without issue, and essentially just turns Nezha into a fast version of Rhino. This ability is arguably his best, and it makes a lot of sense why, due to the fact how good this ability is for survivability. Safeguard. It allows warding Halo to be cast on allies at half the total HP of the original. A decent support augment, but does nothing to help Nezha, who to be fair doesn't need it, so you can use this in a squad to increase overall survivability, and it will work out just fine. Use it if you want. Divine Spears. Nezha stabs the ground, forcing spikes to protrude out and impale nearby enemies. This is an AoE CC ability that impales enemies onto spikes. This is a great CC that can be combined with his 2 for some insane damage numbers, and completely immobilize enemies, making this an amazing CC that flows very nicely with his other abilities. Steel Path. Nezha is an absolute beast in Steel Path due to having great damage potential, insane survivability, and arguably some of the best CC in the entire game, and above average mobility on top of that. His 1 can be used to traverse the map faster and slightly increase his DPS, but this really isn't needed. His 2 is his main damage ability, and where near enough all of his damage potential comes from, and this also bars every other source of damage in his arsenal. His 3 makes him effectively invincible, much like Rhino's Iron Skin, and as such gives him some of the best survivability in the entire game. And his 4 gives you one of the best CCs in the game with great range, crowding, and immobilization. His playstyle consists of keeping his 3 up at all times, and then periodically using your 2 and 4 for damage and CC respectively, and clearing areas by doing that combo of initiating with his 4, and then using his 2 to increase damage dealt and killing with either his 2 or weapon damage. The helmet system doesn't really benefit him, but if you want to play around with some abilities, this one is a safe ability to remove without impacting his kit drastically. Overall, he has evolved from fast, slightly worse Rhino to fast Rhino, and has a better CC than Rhino at this point, and can even rival Rhino's sheer damage, making for an extraordinary frame. A+. Nidus, Ability Showcase, Virulence. Nidus hits the floor, spiking a tentacle out of the floor. This is a DPS ability that does mediocre damage. While its damage is poor, luckily this isn't the main use of this ability, that being to gain mutation stacks to buff both his DPS and survivability. And when those stacks get high enough, this ability becomes absolutely absurd in terms of DPS, ending up as his best ability for high stack gameplay. Teaming Virulence is Virulence's augment. It applies 120% primary weapon damage buff after hitting 4 enemies. This makes for a great augment and assists with his lack of low stack DPS, making a great augment to help him maintain DPS when on low stacks. Lava. Nidus shoots out a lava, spinning in place and pulling enemies into the center. This is an AoE CC ability that crowds enemies together nicely. This also has the adverse effect of having a chance to increase the number of stacks Nidus has, and acts as the fastest way to build stacks, and can be comboed with his 1 for even quicker stack gains. This is easily his best ability, and is arguably the best CC in the entire game, and combines very well with AoE weapons for quick kill zones. Lava Burst is Lava's augment. It allows Nidus to explode the lava, dealing toxin damage to all enemies in the lava. It also stacks the damage based on the amount of enemies inside the lava. This makes for an insane damage stack when combined with his 4, and leading to some immense damage when on high stacks. This augment benefits a high stack Nidus more than a low stack one, but is still a very good augment that can be used quite effectively. Parasitic Link. Nidus links himself to an enemy, and this causes them to take the damage Nidus would have. This is a survivability ability that reflects the damage dealt to Nidus to the linked enemy up to 50% of the damage, at the caveat of requiring an enemy and a mutation stack for it to work. This can also be used on an ally to buff their ability strength. This is a helpful survivability tool to reduce damage taken when on low mutation stacks. Ravenous. Nidus summons a growth of infested and maggots to damage nearby enemies and heal himself and allies. This is an AoE DPS ability and survivability ability that deals increased damage depending on the amount of stacks and increased health regen based on the same requirements. This is a great ability, giving Nidus consistent DPS and a survivability tool at the same time. Insatiable is Ravenous's augment. It allows Nidus to have an added chance of getting an extra stack whenever he is in Ravenous ground. This makes for an insane augment that greatly decreases his setup time. It works nicely to maintain high stacks late game. This augment is overall great and definitely usable. Steel Path. Nidus performs great in Steel Path, able to build his stacks without issue, and with a great CC and survivability tool he is far from fragile, and can easily clear almost any content. His 1 starts as his main ability to build stacks with, and then evolves over time into an absolutely ridiculous DPS ability when at high stacks. His 2 is his main CC tool, and can combine with his 1 early game for insanely quick stack generation, or combine with a weapon for great DPS while still generating stacks. His 3 gives him a consistent survivability tool and significantly reduces the damage he takes, allowing him to act as a tank without much issue. His 4 is a survivability tool and acts as an AoE DPS tool on top of that. It also increases its effects depending on the amount of stacks Nidus has, which can lead to ridiculous DPS from the maggots and absurd healing time. He doesn't really benefit from the helmet system due to his kit flowing together extremely well. Overall, an amazing frame capable of doing almost any job for any team. The only downside is that he requires a long setup time for his amazing DPS. But even so, it doesn't really affect him that badly, as he still has an insane CC in his 2, and consistent survivability and DPS in his 3 and 4. A. Nova. Ability Showcase. Null Star. Nova has up to 6 stars orbiting around her, giving her passive damage reduction, as well as damage upon impact. This is a single target DPS ability and a survivability ability that gives Nova a passive 30% damage reduction, and slightly increases her DPS. The only issue with this ability is that its damage reduction effect is its main use, and the other effect makes it counterintuitive as it actively seeks out enemies which can cause Nova to be left with 0 damage reduction and lead to a quick down. And the damage this ability does is minuscule to make it worth using for DPS. Neutron Star is Null Star's augment. It allows for Nova to willingly trigger the stars to explode, but as this ability is better used for its damage reduction, this doesn't help and makes it a near useless augment. Antimatter Drop. Nova launches a ball of matter that can be shot into, absorbing the damage and multiplying it up to 8 times. This is an AoE DPS ability that can be easily used with any half-decent weapon to casually drop 100k plus damage whenever you need it, and as a result makes for an excellent DPS ability. Antimatter Absorb is Antimatter's augment. It allows the ability to absorb any damage on top of weapon damage fired into it, overall increasing the DPS significantly. This is an amazing augment for DPS Novas, used extremely effectively. Wormhole. Nova summons a portal to teleport for rotation. This is a mobility and traversal ability that causes Nova to instantaneously teleport to the target area, making it a great traversal tool. Also easily used to get away and move on to This is an amazing
prepare for life
ability
support.
and can be easily used to speedrun through missions. Escape velocity is Wormhole augment. It applies a 50% speed boost to allies and uses for 7 seconds. Greatly speeding up runtime and uses macro resin. But I would recommend the traversal augment as the speed at which you run is involved with partial aspects of the molecular time. Nova summons an aura that afflicts nearby enemies causing them to explode and kill. This is an AoE DPS.
I've delivered a life support
debuff
capsule to the
utility
area.
ability. There's 3
Activating
effects.
it will buy you more time.
Summons particles around the affected enemy that explode upon dealing massive damage to nearby enemies. This also increases damage dealt to enemies up to 2 times multiplier. The other 2 effects are a speed buff and an E buff for enemies when built for low. Molecular
Life
time will
support
speed up
activated.
enemies, helping for long-winded missions such as defense and excavation or survival. Or when built for higher strength, slows the enemies down, helping for slowing down the pace or killing a lot of enemies in one area. This can be really easily used to nuke an entire map or speed up a painfully slow defense or survival mission. Or when the pace of the mission is too fast and you want to crowd a bunch of enemies, this is your go-to. This is an absurd ability for utility and DPS. Molecular fusion is Molecular Time's augment. It causes prime enemies to award Nova 2 Null Star charges upon their death, greatly increasing the usability of her 1 and making her less frail, and rewards her for playing close up rather than having to stay out of range to maintain damage reduction, making for an excellent augment that greatly increases her survivability. Steel Path. Nova performs well in Steel Path, really only struggling with survivability due to the inconsistent nature of her 1. This can cause some slight issues leading to her getting insta-killed, but her other 3 abilities more than make up for this shortcoming. Her 1 is used to give her passive damage reduction, requiring a longer range style of play to keep the damage reduction up. Her 2 is used if you ever need a quick burst of AoE damage to wipe a room. This also stacks with the DPS multiplier of her 4, which increases her DPS drastically. Her 3 is used for quick and efficient map traversal or as a quick escape from a dangerous area. And her 4 does everything: long range, debuff, damage multiplier, and insane DPS. Her playstyle mainly consists of using her 1 for damage reduction and staying outside the range of enemies, as to not lose the damage reduction, using her 2 to area clear efficiently, or to deal massive damage but massive burst damage to one unit. Her 3 is used to traverse the map quickly or to get away from a problematic situation, and her 4 is used all the time to buff overall damage and the damage of her 2. This is also used to speed up the enemies, increasing run speeds, or slow down the pace to CC more effectively, or to protect an area. She can benefit from the helmet system, replacing her 1 with a more effective and consistent survivability option. Overall, Queen of Matter is a beast of utility and DPS, easily able to clear content with her 2 and 4 combined, and speedrunning through the map with her 3, and all mission types with her 4. The only real shortcoming is her lack of consistent survivability. A. Nyx, Ability Showcase. Mind Control. Nyx dominates the mind of an enemy, forcing them into submission. This is a single target CC ability that forces an enemy to fight for you. While a cool concept, in reality it doesn't work that well, mainly due to the AI being beyond dumb a lot of the time, and the lack of scaling damage from the controlled enemies. Even with the change allowing her to deal damage to enemies, and converting the damage dealt to a damage buff for the enemies, this doesn't help this ability at all, making the damage they deal irrelevant, and are mainly just used to destruct aggro sponge, or to just cheese and immobilize enemies, to avoid having to engage them. Even this is still completely useless due to her 3 just being a wider ranged and overall better CC than her 1 though. Mind Freak is Mind Control's augment. It increases the damage the target does by 500%, and while in theory this is pretty decent, the problem comes with the target's AI being pretty horrible, and as a result makes her an inconsistent DPS ability and an inconsistent augment. Psychic Bolts. Nyx shoots out bolts to seek out nearby enemies. This is an AoE debuff ability that can strip enemy armor and shields up to 100%. Combine this with a decent weapon, and you have a force to be reckoned with. This is only rivaled by her 3 for her best ability, and due to the change of the max armor strip, makes this the best armor strip in the entire game. Pacifying Bolts is Psychic Bolts' augment. It causes afflicted enemies to become confused, possibly missing attacks. This is pretty bad due to the evasion mechanics in general being lackluster and inconsistent, so I would avoid this augment, and Psychic Bolts is already decent without it regardless. Chaos. Nyx radiates an aura around herself, causing nearby enemies to attack each other. This is an AoE CC ability that causes enemies in range to stop attacking each other, or start attacking each other. This is a great CC as it distracts nearby enemies and still allows you to damage them, making this good as a crowding option on top of immobilizing enemies. This is tied with the buff Psychic Bolts as her best ability, and this ability definitely shines through on a pretty underwhelming frame overall. Chaos Sphere is Chaos's augment. It causes the ability's range to shrink over time, which actually hinders its ability to CC large groups of enemies, and makes the augment decrease the effectiveness of the original ability, making the augment straight up bad. Absorb. Nyx becomes enveloped in a bubble that absorbs incoming damage. This is an AoE DPS / survivability ability that absorbs all damage dealt to Nyx while the ability is active. This damages all enemies in range by the amount of damage absorbed, making this an okay DPS ability. But the main use of this ability is when you're in trouble of dying, you can pop this to become immortal for the duration. The simulation absorbs augment. It allows Nyx to move while in the ability, which does nothing to help its shortcomings and makes her a bad augment. Steel Path. Nyx benefits a lot from Steel Path compared to normal gameplay, mainly with her CC potential and DPS potential skyrocketing due to the increase in base enemy levels. Her 1 isn't really ever used unless you need an immortal aggro sponge / distraction. Her 2 is used to armor strip and then kill anything with weapon damage. Her 3 is used to CC a wide area, effectively crowding them in before combining them with her 2 to armor strip and then kill them with high weapon damage or a niche use of absorb. Her 4 is only ever used to deal okay DPS or as an escape tool when about to die, as this makes her completely vulnerable to damage. Her main playstyle consists of using her 2 and 3 periodically to CC and then armor strip, and finally finishing with a high damage weapon or an absorb. while her 4 is used for a large burst of damage, or more commonly when she's about to die as a free escape tool. She would benefit from a damage ability as a replacement for her 1 or 4 to increase her DPS and decrease her reliance on weapon damage drastically. Overall, Nyx is a great CC frame and has great utility and debuff potential with her 3, and mediocre damage and survivability in her 4, and a near useless ability in her 1. And purely because of the changes to her 2, she has improved the most in ranking, going to a C+ from her previous spot as the worst frame in the whole game. C+. Oberon, ability showcase, Smite. Oberon summons an energy bolt striking at the enemy targeted. This is a single target DPS ability that does piss poor damage, to be honest, and doesn't really have any adverse effects apart from applying one of the worst offensive procs in Radiation. Smite Infusion is Smite's augment. It allows you to cast Smite on allies, giving the weapons a radiation damage buff, and with Red being a bad offensive proc, makes for a useless augment. Hallowed Ground. Oberon summons some Hallowed Grass that prevents debuffs when in range. This is an AoE utility /buff/DPS ability that also prevents debuffs and status effects when in range. This also slightly damages enemies and affects the radiation status effect upon them. This can also be combined with his 3 for bonus armor. Hallowed Eruption is Hallowed Ground's augment. It causes the original ground to explode when the ability is recast, dealing radiation damage to all enemies nearby. And with radiation being a bad offensive proc, makes this a mediocre damage potential, making for a mediocre augment. Renewal. Oberon radiates an aura around himself, healing himself and allies in range. This is an AoE survivability ability that heals Oberon and allies in range by up to 40 HP per second. This makes it easily his best ability and the only reason Oberon has any survivability at all really, as he has no damage reduction whatsoever. This also heals you instantly for 125 HP, making it a useful burst heal in the event of an emergency. As mentioned earlier, this can also be combined with his 2 to give you a base armor buff of 200, slightly increasing the damage you can take. Phoenix Renewal is Renewal's augment. Whenever Oberon or allies take fatal damage, they are instead healed to 50% of their HP, essentially making you and your whole team immortal as long as this ability is up, making for an amazing augment, especially in a squad, and solo it greatly increases his survivability, making for a great augment overall, and definitely worth using. Reckoning. Oberon holds enemies in place, dealing a quick burst of damage. This is an AoE DPS/CC ability that lifts enemies into the air before dealing burst damage to them. This also applies a radiation status effect and reduces their armor by up to 30%, making it a somewhat health or armor strip to then rely on weapon damage for the main DPS. Hallowed Reckoning is Reckoning's augment. It applies an armor buff and added damage per enemy affected by the ability, making this ability deal bonus damage and also grant Oberon and his team additional survivability, making this a pretty decent augment and can be used quite effectively. Steel Path. Oberon performs okay in Steel Path, mainly due to his 3 making himself nigh unkillable, and then using his 4 for damage, and then occasionally using his 2 to remove debuffs. His 1 can be used for a quick burst of damage, but the damage isn't significant, and the resulting radiation proc doesn't help this in any way. His 2 is used to prevent debuffs, or in combination with his 3 for the net 200 armor buff, and not really used for the DPS, and the DPS is laughable in comparison to both weapon damage and his 1 and 4. His 3 is used for consistent survivability, and in combination with his 2 for the net armor buff, it is also used to burst heal whenever he gets low enough. His 4 is his main DPS ability, having the adverse effect of a slight CC and armor strip, increasing the damage of both his 1 and more significantly, his weapon damage. He could benefit from the helmet system either through a DPS ability or a CC that helps with his reckoning damage. Overall, the GOAT struggles in the Steel Path, mainly due to the lack of DPS and CC, but slightly covers it with his consistent survivability in his his OK utility in his 2, and OK damage in his 4 and 1, but still not high enough to warrant being above B-. B-. Octavia, ability showcase, Mallet. Octavia throws out a mallet activated by the percussion of the Manticord. This is an AoE DPS ability that reflects the damage dealt to the mallet to the surrounding area. This is an amazing DPS ability with great range that has stacking damage until the duration ends. The only downside to this ability is that it requires enemies to shoot at it for the immense damage to trigger, making it bad against lower leveled enemies, but anything can clear low level enemies, making this a non-factor. Partitioned mallet is mallet's augment. It allows for Octavia to place down 2 mallets. This greatly increases the area that her mallet can be used in. The only downside is that the damage is halved, so in general it's still better to use one with a lot of range, making for a usable augment, but not necessary. Resonator. Octavia summons a rolling ball distracting nearby enemies. This is a utility ability that distracts nearby enemies by playing music to distract enemies. This does 0 damage and acts mainly as a distraction, but this ability can also be combined with her 1 to move it around the map, but this isn't recommended most of the time due to her 2 making it harder for her 1 to build up its damage. Conductor is Resonator's augment. This allows Octavia to move the Resonator to the location of her reticle at 150% speed, allowing it to instantaneously distract any enemies around the Resonator. This is an arcane augment, but the ability itself is quite poor in general. Metronome. Octavia's music buffs herself and allies with buffs. This is an AoE buff ability that applies the following 4 buffs. Vivace, a speed buff awarded for jumping in time with the metronome. Nocturne, an invisibility buff awarded for crouching in time to the metronome. Opera, a multi-shot buff awarded from shooting in time with the metronome. And Forte, a melee damage buff awarded for swinging your melee in time with the metronome. This ability also applies a 35% armor buff to Octavia and all allies for the duration of the ability. Vivace buffs Octavia's and allies' movement speed by 30%, which allows for faster mission clears, but is overall probably the least useful of Octavia's buffs, and is near enough never gained on purpose. Nocturne cloaks Octavia and allies. This is overall probably the best of her buffs, and also the easiest to consistently proc, as all you have to do is crouch in time with the music. Opera buffs the multi-shot of Octavia and allies' weapons by up to 30%, greatly increasing the damage, but is the hardest to trigger willingly due to the timing being quite strict. Forte buffs Octavia's and allies' melee damage by up to 30% and is the second easiest to trigger willingly, as if you're swinging your weapon, you're likely to trigger the buff accidentally anyway. This is overall an amazing buff ability, and as all the buffs greatly impact and improve her gameplay, and even gives her some desperately needed survivability. Amp. Octavia increases the volume of the music. This is an AoE buff ability that buffs weapon damage and mallets damage based on the amount of sound in the area. This makes it rather inconsistent, but will always have some sort of damage buff. The buff's minimum damage multiplier is 25% and its maximum is 200%, either way making a significant improvement to Octavia's overall DPS. This ability also increases the range of mallet and doubles its damage. Steelpath. To no one's surprise, the Queen of Music absolutely destroys Steelpath with her scaling damage from her 1, incredible buffs from her 3, and a straight damage buff from her 4, as well as distraction from her 2, making for an insane kit when combined together. Her 1 is her main DPS and has great range and the damage scales over time, and also uses damage dealt to it, reflecting it into the sound waves, greatly increasing overall DPS. Her 2 is only used as distraction, and its other purpose of moving the mallet around isn't really that good anymore, as mallet is better off stationary now. Her 3 applies 4 amazing buffs to her movement speed, multi-shot melee damage and invisibility, the latter of which greatly improves her survivability. All of this on top of the net armor buff this ability gives her as well. Her 4 is a base damage buff based on sound, which isn't hard to maintain when all of her abilities make sound on top of gunfire, also contributing to the sound level. Her playstyle consists of using her 1 for great scaling damage, occasionally using her 2 to distract constantly, using her 3 to maintain her buff, and periodically using her 4 to increase damage and increase her 1's range and damage output, making Octavia the queen of literally everything. The Music Maestro herself is overall a near flawless frame. The only flaw she has is a now mediocre 2 that doesn't really have a purpose in her kit, other than that, she has everything else covered. Amazing scaling DPS in her 1, incredible buffs in her 3, and a net damage buff in her 4 make for an absolutely outstanding Warframe. An easy S. Protea. Ability Showcase. Grenade Fan. Protea shoots out grenades or has them orbit around her. This is either an AoE DPS ability or a survivability ability, doing one of 2 effects, these being: Protea shoots out a span of grenades that explodes into a vortex, damaging nearby enemies, making for some decent DPS, or the grenades orbit around her, turning into shield satellites that greatly increase her shield capacity, granting the frail frame some much needed survivability. This is also easily the best ability to use to build up her added 100% bonus strength after 3 abilities passive. Blaze Artillery. Protea summons on an artillery cannon that shoots a flaming projectile. This is a single target DPS ability that deals decent damage and also applies a heat status effect. This does decent heat damage and makes her a great way of building up her passive of an added 100% ability strength after using 3 abilities. Dispensary. Protea summons a dispensary that outputs either ammo, energy, or health. This is a utility ability that can be used to quickly stock up on supplies, which grants Protea some added survivability. However, this ability doesn't really do much, as the energy and health drops are only 100 HP for the health orb, and the base 25 energy from the energy orbs, not making it a great energy restoring option. But to combat this, the drops can also be dropped multiple times. This also grants Protea and allies 10% of the ammo of their equipped weapon. Repair Dispensary. This allows Protea to hold down the ability button to summon a dispensary that repairs companion mowers and sentinels, and due to the situational nature of both mowers and sentinels, this makes her a basically useless augment. Temporal Anchor. Protea places an anchor in time, she can then deal damage before teleporting 3 seconds back in time, dealing the dealt damage in an explosion. This is an AoE DPS / survivability ability, as the explosion deals the damage dealt in the 3 seconds, making for a decent DPS option, and also prevents Protea from dying, as if she dies in the 3 seconds, she will simply get rewound before she died, making her effectively immortal for that 3-second time window. Steel Path. Protea performs decently in Steel Path, mainly due to her great DPS from her 1 and 2, and her passive ability combining on top of the more situational damage her 4 supplies. Her 1 is mainly used to build her passive damage bonus and to slightly increase her overall DPS. Her 2 is her main DPS tool that also works as a tool to build her passive, just slightly worse than her 1, as her 2 works better as the ability to take advantage of the passive damage buff. Her 3 is mainly used when Protea needs energy or some health when low. Her 4 has situational DPS, but its main usage is to make her effectively immortal when in a pinch. Her main playstyle consists of using her 1 to build her passive damage buff, before using her 2 to deal the wide bulk of the damage. Her 3 is her main support ability, giving her consistent energy gain and bonus health and consistent healing opportunities. And her 4 is mainly used to make her immortal for that 3-second time period, and then deal a large amount of AoE damage to its surrounding enemies. All of her abilities have great synergy, but if you were to replace 1 for a helmet ability, her 4 is her least useful ability. Overall, Protea is an amazing frame with consistent DPS in both her 1 and 2, decent survivability with the other part of her 1 and her 3, and one of the best panic buttons in the game in her 4, A+. Revenant, ability showcase. Enthrall. Revenant converts an enemy into a thrall. This is a single target CC ability that converts one enemy to a thrall that attacks other enemies. All enemies hit by the thrall will also be transformed into one. When these enemies die, they become a pillar of energy, damaging enemies in the close vicinity. Thrall Pact is Enthrall's augment. It applies a stackable 25% weapon damage buff per enemy enthralled. This is an amazing augment, greatly increasing the DPS of Revenant. This makes her an insane augment with great impact on Revenant's overall ability. Mesmerskin. Revenant envelops himself in sentient energy, protecting him from incoming damage. This is a buff / survivability / CC ability that gives Revenant up to 6 charges. Whenever he is attacked by an enemy, a charge is consumed. Mesmerskin then deals 100% of the reflected damage and inflicts the status effect if the attack had one. The enemy is also stunned for a duration. When an enemy is stunned by Mesmerskin, it costs no energy to cast his 1 on the stunned target. And while Reeve is active, hitting an enthralled enemy with it will gain charges from Mesmerskin. This is a great survivability tool, as it is essentially makes you invincible while you have charges, which are easy to maintain with the Reeve synergy, restoring your charges. Reeve. Revenant dashes forward, leeching health and shields of enemies hit. This is more effective against thralled enemies. This is a single target DPS / survivability / traversal ability that leeches health and shields from enemies, becoming more effective when used on thralled enemies. This maxes out 8% lifesteal on normal enemies and 40% lifesteal on thralled enemies, greatly increasing his survivability and also dealing some decent DPS, as well as quickly traversing the map. This is also used as the primary method of keeping his 2 up along with the thralls from his 1. Blinding Reeve is Reeve's augment. It applies a blind to all enemies passed through for 10 seconds, greatly increasing Revenant's CC potential. This also makes for a useful augment, as it gives Revenant some additional CC to them. Combine this with his 1 to build extra thralls. Dance Macabre. Revenant unleashes a devastating amount of sentient energy in his vicinity. This is an AoE DPS ability that causes Revenant to damage nearby enemies with adaptive Eidolon beams, which change the status ailment depending on the enemy's weakness. This makes it a great DPS ability for all enemy types. This also reflects the damage dealt to him back into the beams, increasing their damage. The fire button can also be held down to increase the damage and status conditions effectiveness, on the downside of greatly increasing the energy drain. Combining this ability with his 1 leads to gaining drastic amounts of overshield, greatly improving survivability. This can also be used with his 3 to instantaneously move across the map, and also reduces the cost of his 3. Steel Path. One of the biggest surprises of the testing was Revenant performing well above my expectations. Due to having a very interesting kit and extremely good survivability and DPS, he was a pleasant surprise to play with. His 1 is mainly used to set up a large amount of thralls to eventually combo with his 3 for overwhelming DPS, or with his 4 for even more survivability. His 2 is his main survivability tool and also has some great damage potential due to the reflective nature of this ability. This can then be combined with his 3 and 1 for endless charges. His 3 is mainly used to either charge his 2 or to deal a great amount of DPS in conjunction with his 1. His 4 is used to deal massive AoE DPS or to gain extra shields to help even more with his survivability. His playstyle consists of constantly using his 1 to maintain his thralls, to then breathe through them to deal high DPS and also heal yourself, as well as maintain the charges of his 2. He uses his 2 to negate all damage and then uses his 3 on thralls to maintain his charges, while his 4 is only ever used to area clear or to build overshields. He doesn't really benefit from the helmet system, as almost all of his abilities have a large amount of synergy with each other. Overall, a great improvement in Steel Path compared to normal gameplay, with excellent CC in his 1, amazing survivability in his 2, great DPS in his 3, and good AoE DPS in his 4. B+. Rhino. Ability Showcase. Rhino Charge. Rhino charges at enemies in his line of sight, damaging and ragdolling them. This is a single target DPS ability, and while this ability's DPS is lackluster at first, its combo mechanics greatly increase its DPS up to a 4 times multiplier, and 70% reduced energy cost, effectively allowing you to spam this ability for a great overall DPS ability. Ironclad Charge is Rhino's charge's augment. It applies a stackable 50% armor buff per enemy hit with the charge, making for a great added survivability tool, and a great synergy with this too. Iron Skin. Rhino envelops himself in a layer of iron armor, absorbing incoming damage and adding to his overall armor. This is a survivability ability that causes Rhino to envelop himself in a layer of armor that absorbs incoming damage for a short period, and converting it to the total armor. Rhino is completely invincible while this ability is active. This ability is the be-all, end-all of survivability, allowing Rhino to effortlessly tank any attack as long as this ability is active, and because of that, makes him effectively immortal while he has the ability up. Iron Shrapnel is Iron Skin's augment. It allows for the Iron Skin to be detonated, dealing the remaining value as damage to enemies in the explosion's radius. This makes for an okay augment, but isn't that useful as Rhino doesn't inherently need the added DPS. Roar. Rhino roars, enveloping himself and nearby enemies in an aura. This is an AoE buff ability that greatly increases weapon and ability damage greatly. This is an amazing damage buff that also affects ability damage, which is rare for a damage buff. This damage buff stacks up to 50% added damage. Piercing Roar is Roar's augment. It applies a puncture status effect to all enemies in Roar's radius, dealing damage. This is a terrible augment, mainly due to puncture being arguably the worst status effect in the whole game. Rhino Stomp. Rhino stomps the floor, freezing enemies in midair. This is an AoE CC ability that suspends enemies in midair, completely immobilizing them. This also buffs the damage that his 1 deals to enemies hit by the stomp. Affected enemies also have their follow-up actions and movements slowed by up to 97.5%. This is an amazing CC ability that can be used effectively with other sources to greatly impact the damage Rhino can deal overall. Reinforcing Stomp is Rhino Stomp's augment. It allows for the value of Iron Skin to be repaired by 80 per enemy hit with the Stomp, allowing for a great synergy with the 2 abilities. This is easily his best augment, as it amplifies his best ability even more, allowing him to easily regen his Iron Skin armor while it is active. Steel Path. Again, Rhino, like Nezha, performs amazingly in Steel Path. It turns out being completely immune to all damage types is kinda useful. Who would have thought? His 1 isn't really used at all, but you can use it in conjunction with his 4 for greatly increased damage, especially when the combo mechanics are taken into account, drastically increasing his overall DPS. His 2 is the star of the show, making him completely invulnerable to damage while it has any sort of value. This gives him nearly unrivaled survivability and unlimited opportunities to eliminate enemies in any way he wishes, whether that be buffed weapon damage or his 1. His 3 can be used in conjunction with any weapon to trivialize still path content, as the damage buff this grants is absolutely absurd. His 4 is mainly used to CC a large area to then kill them with either his 1 or buffed weapon damage. His main playstyle is maintaining his 2 at all times, using your 3 to massively buff weapon damage, and periodically using your 4 to CC groups of enemies, to then use your 1, or more commonly, your weapon to kill the enemies. He doesn't really benefit from the helmet system, as he already has nearly everything covered as a frame. Overall, the king of survivability still has yet to be dethroned, able to effortlessly clear content really just through his 2 and 3, with weapon damage. At this point he doesn't even need his 1 and 4, A+. Saryn, ability showcase. Spores. Saryn throws toxin spores at enemies. This is a single target DPS ability that is spread upon the enemy's death, allowing for the ability to cover a massive area of effect. This ability slowly builds stacks over time, greatly increasing the damage they deal over time. This ability at high stacks is among the highest DPS abilities in the entire game, and one of the primary reasons Saryn is as broken as she is. Revealing spores is Spores Augment. It shows all enemies affected by the spores on the radar. While this offers some useful utility, most of the time spores is just going to insta-kill everything anyway, removing the usefulness of the augment. Molt. Saryn sheds her skin, distracting nearby enemies. This is a utility ability that summons a skin, mainly used to distract enemies. This also gives her a slight movement speed buff, allowing her to get away from the area quickly. This is a pretty decent ability that distracts enemies quite effectively, making it a very effective distraction tool and aggro sponge. Regenerative Molt is Molt's Augment. It applies a healing buff that heals Saryn for 50 HP per second, for 10 seconds, amounting to a staggering total of 500 HP restored, making for a great survivability tool and easily Saryn's best augment. Toxin Lash. Saryn envelops her blade in toxin. This is a buff ability that applies a toxin status effect to all weapons for the ability's duration. This is an amazing overall weapon damage buff that is slightly more effective at buffing melee weapons, maxing at 60% damage buff for melee and only 30% for gun damage. But even so, this is still greatly increases her DPS and combines with her other abilities to reach absurd damage numbers. Contagion Cloud is Toxin Lash's augment. It summons a toxic cloud whenever you get a melee kill, but the damage is quite poor, and this leads to a bad augment. Miasma. Saryn unleashes a poison gas, greatly damaging nearby enemies. This is an AoE DPS ability that releases a toxin gas upon enemies. This procs a viral status effect and damages the enemies. The damage is also greatly increased on enemies affected by Saryn's 1. This is an amazing finisher ability when used in conjunction with a high stack 1 for the DPS this ability generates is, to put it simply, is absurd. Still Path. Saryn is among the best frames in the game, and as one would expect from one of the best frames in the game, Still Path is no challenge for this viral disease. Her 1 is her main DPS source, setting us up early and killing the first enemy afflicted to greatly increase the amount of enemies afflicted, and thus greatly increasing her DPS. Her 2 is mainly used to either distract enemies or to run away from a dangerous area. This ability is amazing in both circumstances, working as a great distraction. Her 3 is used to buff her weapon damage massively, increasing her overall DPS. Her 4 is mainly used as a finisher ability in conjunction with her 1 to wipe out entire rooms in mere seconds. Her playstyle consists of using her 1 and killing the first enemy to rapidly spread the infection and build up massive stacks, before then using her 4/3 to area clear and using her 2 whenever she gets in danger. The helmet system predictably doesn't help her much with the fact that all of her abilities have great synergy with each other. Overall, the DPS Queen, only rivaled by Mesa, trivializes just about everything in regards to Still Path, and the game as a whole, with immense DPS in her 1, great distraction in her 2, amazing weapon damage buffs in her 3, and easy area clearing with her 4. You just can't stop this frame right now. S. Sevagoth, Ability Showcase. Due to the nature of Sevagoth's abilities, his abilities and his shadows will be covered separately. Sevagoth's abilities. Reap. Sevagoth sends his shadow in a linear path, damaging enemies in his path and making them more vulnerable to damage. This is a single target DPS/debuff ability. This deals pitiful damage, but has a rather decent debuff effect that makes enemies more vulnerable to damage up to 50%. This also acts as one of the many ways of feeding his passive of the Deathwell. So, Sevagoth produces a wave around himself, afflicted enemies with a tree status condition. This is an AoE DPS ability that slowly damages enemies over time. This ability also gains progress for his passive of the Deathwell. This is a decent ability and works well to deal consistent AoE damage over time, and combines with his 1 for a great burst of 25% damage of the enemy's current health, which deals great DPS but requires you to spam his 1 like no one's business. Gloom. Sevagoth produces an aura around himself, debuffing nearby enemies. This is an AoE debuff/survivability ability that slows down enemies up to 35% and also provides Sevagoth and allies a 5% lifesteal on enemies in the ability's radius. This is the primary method of charging his passive in conjunction with both his 1 and 2. This is overall a great ability, consistently debuffing enemies and supplying Sevagoth with some desperately needed survivability. Exalted Shadow. With the Deathwell full, Sevagoth takes control of the Shadow, unlocking 4 new abilities. The Shadow's abilities are Embrace. The Shadow grabs enemies and brings them closer to it. This is a CC ability that is great at crowding enemies together to then attack with the Shadow's melee weapon of its cause. This is probably the best ability the Shadow has, as it crowds enemies together, making the melee damage it possesses more useful. Consume. The Shadow dashes through enemies, healing itself in the process. This is a survivability ability that steals health off of enemies dashed through at 25% lifesteal, as well as dealing mediocre radiation damage. This is a decent survivability tool and a pretty mediocre DPS ability, making for an okay overall ability. Death's Harvest. The Shadow summons an aura debuffing all enemies in range, making them more susceptible to damage. This is an AoE debuff, which when used in conjunction with its 1 can greatly increase its overall DPS. Reunite. The Shadow becomes 1 with Sevagoth again. Steel Path. Sevagoth is quite an average frame in Steel Path, having some decent DPS and utility, but severely lacking in a good survivability option, as his 3, while okay, doesn't quite make up for his inherent lack of any way of reducing damage taken. He also lacks a good CC option in his Warframe form. His 1 is used as some extra DPS and can be combined with his 2 and 3 for greatly increased passive damage, which in hindsight is pretty much all this ability is good at, as the damage it deals is quite frankly horrible. His 2 is used as his main DPS tool, as the overtime true damage can slowly but surely kill anything in the game. The problem is the time to kill this ability has, and with Sevagoth's innate frailty, he can't really get involved without endangering himself. His 3 is his only survivability tool and helps mitigate the damage he takes, but sometimes you can still get one shot, making this ability completely worthless. But other than those times, a pretty consistent survivability tool. His 4 is the main point of this frame, as it's where almost all of his damage potential comes from, and also has his only CC of any kind. The Shadow's 1 is used to crowd enemies into range of his melee, where he then deals the immense damage his claws can inflict. Its 2 is mainly used as the survivability tool, healing the Shadow up to 25% of the enemy's health, making it a decent tool to sustain the Shadow. Its 3 is used to debuff enemies before combining them with its 1 to deal ludicrous damage, and its 4 is never used, as the Shadow is pretty much superior to Sevagoth in every conceivable way. His playstyle consists of gaining his passive Death Wall using his 1, 2 and 3, and then using his Shadow to deal the forefront of the damage with its 3 and 1 combined. He doesn't really benefit from the helmet system due to almost all of his abilities impacting how quickly he can build his Shadow, which is his main DPS tool. Overall, an okay frame that is just a tad too reliant on his Shadow, and for the first bit of the mission you are essentially a sitting duck with 1 slow DPS option and an okay survivability tool. But after the Shadow is released, he can finally start dealing some damage with his 1 and 3 combined, being easily his best damage combo, and with its 2 to sustain itself, making for an amazing DPS option. But Sevagoth lets his partner down here, so it's a disappointing B-. Titania, Ability Showcase. Spellbind. Titania scatters dust at the location of her reticle, causing all enemies in the dust to ragdoll in midair and gives status immunity to allies and herself. This is an AoE CC/buff ability that works great as a CC tool for immobilizing enemies, or for cleansing her of any status conditions she might have. The ragdoll effect also disarms the enemy. This makes for a great CC and okay utility option in general. Spellbound Harvest is Spellbind's augment. Its effect is when Titania spellbinds 4 enemies, she gains 50 energy, giving her a constant stream of energy. But again, energy generation is not difficult in the slightest, which makes this augment pointless. Tribute. Titania selects an enemy, turning them into a sacrifice to grant her one of 4 buffs. This is a buff ability that grants Titania one of the following buffs. Thorns grants Titania 50% damage reduction and 50% damage reflection. Dust increases the accuracy of enemies by 50, decreases the accuracy of enemies by 50%. Full Moon buffs the damage, health, and armor of companions, and more importantly, her razor fires. And finally, Entangle slows down enemies by up to 25%. Thorns is one of the better buffs and applies a base 50% damage reduction, and Reflection reflecting 50% of all damage dealt to Titania or onto her adversaries. Dust is pretty inarguably her worst buff, as all it does is make the enemies more inaccurate, which is rather bad due to the inconsistency involved to use it as a consistent survivability tool. Full Moon is easily the second best buff, as it increases the damage of Titania's razor fires and companions, which increases her overall DPS. And onto the last buff in Entangle, the second worst buff, acting as a slow CC, which in my opinion is one of the worst types of CC in the game, and as a result I barely use this in gameplay. Lantern. Titania turns an enemy into a distracting beacon, attracting nearby enemies' attention. This is a utility ability that simply acts as a distraction with some slight DPS in the explosion aspect. The DPS is predictably quite bad, and as a result is better off being used to distract enemies rather than for its DPS purpose. Overall, a decent distraction that allows for Titania to escape danger easily. The problem being is Titania is already good at that. Hell, she's a fucking pixie, guys. Beguiling Lantern is Lantern's augment. It causes enemies attracted by the Lantern to take 100% bonus melee damage, giving a Lantern another use other than as a distraction, and can even increase her DPS, making for an okay augment. Razorwing. Titania shrinks down into a pixie form, summoning a swarm of razorfires and drawing 2 smaller weapons. This is an AoE DPS ability that summons razorfires that seek out and damage enemies. This also works as a good traversal option / escape tool just due to the sheer speed she has in this form. She is also essentially impossible to hit and swarm, making this a very safe form to use her new exhausted weapons in. This makes her a decent DPS ability, with the razorfires supplying sufficient AoE DPS and her new weapon supplying the single target damage excellently. Razorwing Blitz is one of the two Razorwing augments, the other being Ironclad Flight. Starting with Razorwing Blitz, it increases the flight speed and fire rate of her 4 when using abilities, which isn't great as speed does nothing to increase her damage, and she's already fast enough without this augment. In regards to Ironclad Flight, it gives Titania 40% damage reduction while in her 4, which isn't great ever due to the fact that she's essentially impossible to hit in her pixie form, making both augments near enough useless. Steel Path. Titania is honestly quite underrated and performs superbly in the Steel Path, not really struggling with anything as her 1 is a great CC option. Her 2 has 2 really helpful buffs, both damage reduction and razorfire damage, which in turn increases the use of her 4, and her 3 works as a great distraction tool. Her 1 is used to CC large areas to then use your 4 to deal the damage to kill them. Her 2 is used mainly to give her some damage reduction and to buff the damage her 4 does. Her 3 is used only to distract enemies or to sponge aggro, and her 4 is used to damage all the enemies and using the new weapons to deal the majority of her damage. The playstyle that Titania uses consists of using her 1 to CC the area before using her 2's best buffs to buff her damage reduction and her 4's overall damage, occasionally using her 3 to distract enemies, and finally using her 4 as the DPS outlet along with her other weapons. She doesn't really benefit from the helmet system, as her abilities already have natural synergy. The Pixie is underrated in Steel Path with consistent CC, good buffs, an okay distraction, and excellent DPS, making for a decent all-round frame. B. Trinity. Ability Showcase. Well of Life. Trinity turns an enemy into a constant lifesteal source. This is a single target utility ability that causes one enemy to be suspended in midair, granting the team lifesteal on the suspended enemy. This is a pretty bad ability all things considered, considering that for half the effort you could literally transference in and out a couple times to achieve the same effect, or cast her 4, either one works considerably better than this dogshit ability. Pool of Life is Well of Life's augment. It causes the affected enemy to drop 4 health orbs and a chance at an energy orb. Neither effect does much of anything, when her 4 insta-heals her, and her 2 gives her consistent energy, making this augment completely redundant, and showing just how dogshit this ability really is. Energy Vampire. Trinity suspends an enemy in animation and radiates an energy pulse from within them, granting the whole team energy. This is a single target utility ability that radiates an energy pulse 4 times, restoring the team's energy by 25 per pulse. This is honestly her second best ability at this point, with her other 2 abilities being garbage tier. Vampire Leech is Energy Vampire's augment. It causes for the excess energy generated to replenish Trinity and ally shields, granting them some added survivability, and while this augment does slightly improve this ability, her 4 just does it so much better again, making this augment worthless. Link. Trinity links to a nearby enemy, granting Trinity 75% damage reduction. This is a single target utility ability that allows Trinity to apply a link to an enemy, granting her some much needed damage resistance. This also reflects the damage dealt to Trinity onto that target. This ability, while good on paper, is mediocre as far as reduction goes, mainly due to the enemy requirement and the fact that if Trinity was about to get insta-killed, her target would instead die. Isn't great, as the same enemy is just likely to kill her afterwards anyway. A baiting link is Link's augment. It applies 145% armor reduction to the enemy linked, which if anything hinders Trin's survivability, as she relies on the enemy to take the incoming damage, which makes this augment completely pointless. Blessing. Trinity pulses an aura that completely restores both her and teammate shields, including companions and stuff like Eidolon laws. This is AoE utility ability that instantly restores the whole team's shields and health with little downside. This makes Blessing the holy grail of Trinity's kit, and effectively makes her unkillable, as long as she has energy, making this easily her best ability. As a plus, this also is the only ability in the game that can heal the laws for Eidolon hunts, making her a staple in the mission type. Steel Path. As predicted, Trinity by herself doesn't perform great, mainly due to the extreme lack of DPS in her kit, and her sole reliance on weapon damage. And while she can fully sustain her energy quite easily with her 2, and make her nigh unkillable with her 4, her 1 and 3 are still lackluster and mediocre. Her 1 is straight up never cast, as energy drain is a non-factor, and her 4 does the healing job much better. Her 2 is used to sustain energy levels, and is great at allowing her to spam both this and her 4, and occasionally her 3. Her 3 is used just to maintain some damage reduction, which makes it a necessity in Steel Path, as otherwise Trin's getting one-shot, and what good is her 4 when you're dead? Speaking of her 4, it is still her best ability by a mile, and easily sustains her throughout a mission, provided she doesn't get one-shot, that is. Her playstyle consists of spamming her 2 to generate energy, never casting her 1, using her 3 at all times to prevent one-shots from occurring, and using your 4 if things get dicey. The helmet system can make an effective impact on Trin's kit due to the severe lack of DPS and CC, and there are a multitude of both types of abilities to choose from, and anything is a straight improvement on her 1. Overall, Trinity struggles by herself quite sadly, with her 1 being a literal waste of energy, and no help at all, and her 2 and 4 being the only saving graces, apart from the mandatory use of her 3 to prevent being punching bag material. And yeah, we have a now very mediocre frame carried by 2 abilities, which by today's standards aren't even great anymore. B-. Okay. Valkyrie. Ability Showcase. Rip Line. Valkyrie shoots out a line that attaches to surfaces, allowing her to swing between structures. This is a traversal ability that attaches lines to structures, allowing her to swing around the area. This can also be used to bring an enemy towards her, and allowing her to then use her massive melee damage to kill it. Swing Line is Rip Line's augment. Its effect is after using a Rip Line to swing into the air, the next 4 uses, provided she is still in the air, become free. This literally lets you become Spider-Man, but at half the speed and absolutely zero combat effectiveness. And with the fact that basic parkour traverses the map just as fast, if not quicker, makes the augment irrelevant. Warcry. Valkyrie lets out a Warcry that greatly increases her melee attack speed. This is a utility ability that also has a minus CC and a slowdown, but as I've stated earlier, this is by far my least favourite CC type. This also has the adverse effect of applying a 50% armor buff on top of the attack speed buff. Unfortunately for the frame as a whole, she has essentially become Warcry, the Warframe, and now that it's her helmet ability, she isn't even that anymore. But in general, this is a great ability, granting some survivability with the armor and increases DPS with the attack speed. Eternal War is Warcry's augment. its effect is whenever Valkyrie gets a melee kill, while Warcry is active, the ability lasts for 2 seconds longer, stacking endlessly, theoretically giving her an infinite melee speed buff. This is an amazing augment. Having Warcry last up for near enough forever is insanely valuable, as this also applies to her 4, and the one weakness of Warcry is its rather low duration, making this augment a staple for DPS-oriented Valkyrie builds. Paralysis. Valkyrie outputs her shields, CCing and damaging enemies in range. This is an AoE CC/debuff ability that knocks back enemies and also does damage based on the amount of shields present. This can lead to decent bursts of damage and with a slightly better CC to what Warcry offers, but still hails in comparison to Warcry's buff to her overall DPS. Prolonged paralysis is Paralysis's augment. Its effect is causing the enemies to be dragged towards you when affected by the CC, and this also increases the stun time by 200%. This makes for an excellent augment, granting Valkyrie a much needed crowding based CC, so she can get the most out of her 2 and 4's damage combo. This is a definitely usable augment and works well with the Eternal War augment, which can make for an amazing DPS Valk build. Hysteria. Valkyrie screams and draws her claws. This is a DPS ability that causes Valkyrie to become completely invulnerable to all forms of damage, and greatly increase the damage she deals with her exalted claws. This was once the best ability in her arsenal, but nowadays her 4 is being outdamaged by any of the meta melee weapons. And the only thing that her 4 has going for her now is the invulnerability, but even that is lackluster at this point. Hysteria has 2 augments, these being Enraged and Hysterical Assault. Starting with Enraged, its effect is Hysteria's damage and critical chance are increased by 200% at the cost of giving Hysteria a cooldown. And while that sucks, the damage buff more than makes up for it, and the fact that she is still invincible for the 15 seconds still makes it a good ability. Overall, a decent augment that can increase Hysteria's damage at the cost of having to use it in short bursts, which in my opinion is well worth. Hysterical Assault's augment is allowing Valkyrie to jump up to 50 meters to a target attacking them with Hysteria, allowing her to quickly swap targets and deal massive damage very quickly, but doesn't increase the damage it does, and doesn't really offer a good enough effect, making Enraged the slightly better augment for Hysteria. And while all her augments are good, apart from her 1s, I wouldn't recommend running 3 augments on any build. Steel Path. Valkyrie struggles in Steel Path, mainly due to only having 2 good abilities and 2 bad abilities, with her DPS being solely reliant on her Warcry and Hysteria at this point. Her 1 has no helpful or effective use outside of map traversal. Her 2 is used to mainly buff either her melee weapon or her 4's overall DPS, which is her only way of clearing content consistently. Her 3 is basically never used, and if it is used, it's used as a panic button to knock enemies away. And her 4 is still her main DPS tool, and only works as a panic button and a survivability tool as a bonus. Her playstyle mainly consists of using her 2 to buff her 4's damage and ignoring the other half of the kit. She could benefit from the helmet system ability, most likely using a better CC option to crowd a large group of enemies together, to then use her 2 and 4 damage combo to annihilate everything in the crowd. Overall, she is a great DPS Warframe with an ability only good for traversing the map, and even then it isn't great. Her 2 is a stupendous attack speed buff, her 3 is a mediocre CC, and her 4 is a great damage and survivability, but these 2 abilities can only carry her so far. B-. I know someone in particular who's looking really forward to this one. Vauban, Ability Showcase. Tesla Nervos. Vauban releases little drones that seek out and shock enemies. This is an AoE DPS ability, where the tiny drone will shock the enemies to damage them. The problem comes with the fact that the damage output here is pitiful. Realistically, this is his worst ability, as it does 0 damage, and I guess has some form of very questionable CC and elect procs, if you want to go there, but overall a poor ability. Tesla Bank is Tesla Nervos' augment. It applies a storage ability that stores all damage dealt to the target, and releases it in a burst of damage upon death. This does fuck all most of the time, mainly due to the fact that Tesla Nervos itself does fuck all damage, and as a result, the burst also does fuck all damage, making the augment useless. Main layer. Vauban throws one of 4 different items. This is an AoE CC/traversal/DPS/buff ability that has one of the following effects. Tether Coil. Vauban throws the item releasing a tether onto the nearby enemies, CCing them. Vector Pad. Vorman throws a pad onto the floor and allows him to get a sudden burst of speed in one direction. Fleshed Orb. Vorman throws the orb on a surface where it implodes into a massive volley of nails, flying in every direction, dealing massive damage. Overdriver. Vorman throws an orb onto the floor that seeks out an ally, and when attached, slightly buffs their weapon damage. Tether Coil is probably the best one of these abilities, as it gives him some extra CC to an already CC oriented frame, and the CC it provides is actually quite decent, being able to immobilize groups of enemies easily. Unfortunately, his 4 is just better at this, to be honest. Vector Pad is the worst of these abilities, with the effect being lackluster even for its intended use of map traversal, as the speed boost does fuck all, and isn't omnidirectional for some fucking reason DE. Fletcher Orb is the second best ability, as it applies some form of DPS to this frame's kit, and while the DPS is bad, it does have scaling damage, making it somewhat okay and decent in combination with his other CC tools. Overdriver is the second worst ability here, with it buffing allies' weapon damage, making it somewhat helpful to combine with the weapon damage and another CC tool, as this damage buff does stack with this passive. So yeah, it's actually quite a helpful weapon damage buff. Photon Strike. Warben throws a beacon on the ground, calling in a photon strike on the targeted area. This is an AoE DPS ability that blows the affected area up. This is an okay DPS ability, far better than it was on release, as it actually has some damage scaling now, making it somewhat usable. Keyword somewhat, and even then this is still outdamaged by his 4, combined with his passive and Overdriver's buff. Photon Repeater is Photon Strike's augment. Its effect is when the original strike hits 4 or more enemies, the next one costs no energy. Well, okay, the damage is still mediocre, and is still outdamaged by weapons, making the augment pointless. But still. Vorman throws a device encircling an area, forcing all enemies in its radius to be suspended in midair. The ability button can be pressed again to collapse a vortex, sucking everything into it. This is a AoE CC ability that causes enemies to be immobilized or crowded together with its secondary effect. This also acts as an armor strip and armor buff to allies, granting Vorban some desperately needed form of survivability. Overall, this is the holy grail of his kit, and the sole reason he is the king of CC. Repelling Bastille is Bastille's augment. It repels enemies away from the area, and the vortex duration is increased to each vortex thrown inside. This is a pretty bad augment, as crowding is almost always better than knockback, and while the vortex's added duration is good, the augment weakens Bastille considerably, so I would still use the original Bastille over the augment. Steel Path. Vorban performs decently on Steel Path, relying mostly on his 4 CC and weapon damage, as even though he has some scaling damage with his 2 DPS abilities, now the damage still isn't great. His 1 is essentially a meme ability, only used for the lols, as it has no real purpose. His 2 is only used to deal added DPS with Fletcher Orb, CC smaller groups with Tether Coil, even though his 4 is just a better CC in every shape and form, or further buff his weapon damage with Overdriver. His 3 is never used as the damage, even taking into account the scaling it has, is still poor for Warframe standards. And while it can be combined with his 4 for some added DPS, weapon damage is just strictly superior in all honesty. And his 4 is essentially used for everything. CC a massive area, check. Crowd all enemies into one spot to kill them with massively buffed at weapon damage, check. Defending an area in any objective-based game mode, check. This ability does it all. He can benefit from the helmet system, usually with either a better DPS ability or a survivability ability to help him with his innate frailty. His playstyle consists of using his 2 to CC/damage small groups of enemies, and using his 4 to CC large areas and get the majority of his DPS, when combined with the buff from his 2 and the passive buff. Overall, he is the king of CC, and that's about all he's good for. He has scaling damage now, but it's still ass, and weapon damage outdamages it without much issue, especially when combined with his overdriver and passive. His 1 is again useless, his 2 is niche with some slightly decent effects, his 3 is just not worth casting, and his 4 does everything you need it to, and more. He is still for the Warframe, and some slightly better buffs with his 2. B+. Volt. Ability Showcase. Shock. Volt shocks an enemy with lightning. This is a single target DPS ability with some slight AoE effect in the chain element, that in all honesty does no damage. It is just a worse version of S4 and doesn't do anything else, making it a very bog standard ability, and not a good one at that. Shock Trooper is Shock's augment. It adds an extra electric buff to his and allies in range weapons. This is a decent weapon damage buff, especially combined with his 3. but this isn't that helpful in normal gameplay and really only has a niche use in an Eidolon Hunt based DPS build. Overall, a good augment that can be used quite effectively. Speed. Vault buffs his movement speed. This is buff / traversal ability that dramatically increases Vault's movement speed. This also has another effect of increasing his reload speed, but that does fuck all in every circumstance. The speed buff is nice, but it doesn't really do anything for him aside letting him speedrun capture nodes, making it a good traversal ability, but not helpful to his kit in any way. Shocking speed is speed's augment. It applies an elect proc to any enemy sprinted past. This does laughable damage, and isn't even worth equipping since speed is best used for node speedruns rather than damage builds. Electric Shield. Vault summons a shield out of electricity. This is a survivability ability that summons a shield that deflects incoming damage. This can also be shocked to add extra electric damage to attacks, but this isn't really used outside of Eidolon hunts anyway. This also applies a 200% critical damage buff to any projectile fired through a shield. Transistor Shield is Electric Shield's augment. It allows allies to pick up the shield and converting all damage dealt to the shields into a 300% damage multiplier for his discharge. Now that sounds great on paper, but it requires your allies to pick up the shields, which from my experience, they never do. Add on the fact that while picking up his shield doesn't offer the same effect as the augment, makes her a very situational augment. Discharge. Vault releases pulse of electricity, damaging and immobilizing nearby enemies. This is an AoE CC/DPS ability that has Vault unleash electricity everywhere. This is probably his best ability, and his only real way of doing damage or CCing anything in general. And to be fair, that's actually pretty decent at this job, immobilizing enemies and damaging them. The damage aspect, while poor due to no scaling, isn't horrible to the point of uselessness. Capitance is Discharge's augment, or Capacitance is Discharge's augment. It converts dealt damage by the discharge into shields for him and allies. This does grant him some decent survivability, but doesn't address the glaring issue of the lack of DPS his 4 has, making it an okay augment but not helpful in a DPS oriented build, mainly used on a support vault. Steel Path. Vault performs quite averagely in the Steel Path, mainly because he relies on the CC from his 4 and the weapon damage buff of his 3 to effectively clear any content. His 1 is completely useless and a much worse version of his 4. His 2 is just a mobility increase, helpful for escaping or speedrunning a capture node, but not much else. His 3 buffs his weapon damage and is the only way for him to mitigate damage taken, making it actually pretty decent, and his 4 is used to CC a large area and deal okay damage to them. His playstyle consists of using his 3 and 4 to room clear, relying on the CC and weapon damage buff of his 3 to clear content, and while a hassle to do it does this quite effectively, not nearly as efficiently as other thoriums, but still quite effective in his own right. He can benefit from the helmet system, with his 1 being a free helmet slot, and needing a more consistent survivability option makes the helmet system great for Vault. Overall, the Speed Demon doesn't have anything going for him anymore with the introduction of Gauss, and the damage and CC he deals, while great, aren't amazing anymore, and he's just a slow frame that gets outclassed rather easily. B. Wisp, Ability Showcase. Reservoirs. Wisp places down 3 reservoirs. This is a utility ability that has 3 effects, these being Vitality, a healing buff that also applies a damage buff to her 4, a speed buff that buffs movement speed, attack speed and fire rate, greatly increasing her DPS. This also applies a corrosive proc to her 4, and lastly, the shock buff that CCs enemies when in range of Wisp and allies and makes her a pretty decent CC. This also further buffs the damage of her 4. Overall, this is the new Gara support abilities, being able to CC, heal and massively buff allies with 1 ability. Move along Trinity, there's a new girl in town. I say new even though she was released 3 years ago at this point, but oh well. Fused Reservoir is Reservoir's augment. This allows Wisp to summon a new 4th reservoir that has all effects of the main 3 and stacks with their effects. This can lead to some insanely high buff stacking and lead to insane survivability, DPS and CC all in one. Overall, this is an amazing augment and a must for any support based Wisp, as it increases her support value with 0 downside, other than energy, which is never a major issue. Will-O-Wisp. Wisp summons a clone that she can teleport to. This is a utility ability, mainly acting as a distraction to leave the area or teleport into an area and kill everything. This is a helpful tool, especially with the distraction element to it, as well as the added mobility it grants her, but even so, probably her last ability. Breach Surge. Wisp afflicts a target with the surge, killing them will cause the surge to seek out nearby enemies, damaging them. This is a CC/DPS/debuff ability that blinds enemies at the start of the ability's cast duration, and damages them, constantly inflicting a radiation proc and applying a damage multiplier to any enemy affected by the surge. This can also be combined with her 2 for a second surge when the ability is cast. This also has the niche effect of allowing her to teleport to her reservoirs. This is easily her best ability, covering multiple bases, and is for some reason her subsumable ability, meaning that every single frame of the game can have this absolute beast of an ability. Critical Surge is Breach Surge's augment. It applies a crit buff when Wisp teleports to a reservoir, which grants her a critical chance buff only for snipers, which stacks based on how far Wisp travelled in the teleport, which while good is far too situational to ever be used in normal gameplay, and is difficult to effectively use in an Eidolon hunt or an alternative, making it a very situational augment. Soulgate. Wisp summons the power of the sun, redirecting it against enemies. This is an AoE DPS ability that gets stronger when you hold down the ability button. This also gets stronger the longer it is used on one enemy, causing them to become more susceptible to damage. In theory, this actually has infinitely scaling damage. The only problem is that it takes too long to get high enough for that to matter, to the point of her 3 and weapon damage kills get the kills far quicker than this can, and while not useless, this ability is bested by Breach Surge for DPS. Steel Path. Wisp is amazing in Steel Path, with great survivability and universal buffs with her 1, decent utility and distraction with her 2, amazing DPS in her 3, and a solid consistent DPS option in her 4. She has the whole package of a complete frame. Her 1 is amazing, offering consistent healing, incredible speed buffs that massively increase her overall DPS, and an amazing CC. Her 1 is an absolutely outstanding ability. Her 2 is okay mobility and decent utility, but essentially just being a distraction tool, unless used with her 3 to increase its area of effect. Her 3 is her main DPS tool that massively increases overall DPS with the damage multiplier it applies to the affected enemies, as well as the CC it has upon cast. Her 4 is a semi-consistent DPS tool that can infinitely scale to infinite damage, apart from the fact that it's straight up never going to happen, and it scales too slow to the point of Breach Surge easily out DPSing it. Her playstyle consists of placing down her 1 at the start, buffing her DPS, giving her a consistent CC and great healing capabilities, periodically using her 2 and using her 3 whenever a large group of enemies needs to be taken out, and using her 4 whenever she wants to, as it just adds to her overall DPS. The helmet system doesn't really benefit her, as all her abilities synergize very well together. Overall, the new Queen of Survivor support completely demolishes Steel Path with CC, great buffs and healing with her 1, okay mobility and utility in her 2, amazing DPS and CC with her 3, and consistent DPS in her 4. An absolute machine of both supporting and damaging. S. Wukong, Ability Showcase. Celestial Twin. Wukong summons a clone that uses the opposite weapon type of what you are using currently. This is a DPS ability that summons a clone that damages enemies using either your equipped melee or primary weapon. This is a decent DPS ability, as it's 2 people using the same weapons, essentially doubling your DPS, and the DPS can be doubled yet again by using the ability again to target a specific enemy, dealing double damage. Celestial Stomp is Celestial Twin's augment. It allows the clone to stomp, CCing the enemies in the 20-meter radius by holding the ability button. This is a great augment, as it gives Wukong some much needed CC, and because of that, improves the ability greatly, and makes this a great augment. Cloudwalker. Wukong transforms into a cloud, healing himself rapidly and disappearing from the battlefield briefly. This is a survivability / mobility ability that greatly heals Wukong and his clone, as well as turning him invisible and increasing his movement speed. This is a great survivability tool due to the immense healing, and can also be used in Spy or for mobility due to the invis and speed. Enveloping Cloud is Cloudwalker's augment. It causes allies in range of the Cloudwalker to also become invisible. This is a decent support based augment, but useless for Wukong himself, making for a poor augment overall. Defy. Wukong and his clone become invulnerable to damage for the duration. This is a survivability / DPS ability that makes Waking Wukong invulnerable, storing all damage taken before slowing his staff down, dealing the equivalent damage to enemies in range. After this, the damage dealt is converted to armor and applied to Wukong. This is an amazing ability and probably his best, only really rivaled by his 1. This ability does everything, works as a fantastic panic button, gives Wukong lasting survivability with the armor buff, and deals decent damage with the attack itself. Primal Fury. Wukong draws his staff attacking nearby enemies. This is a DPS ability where Wukong draws his exalted staff to attack nearby enemies. This does okay damage, but with the current state of melee being that a normal weapon can easily outdamage exalted ones at this point, there's not much point of using it, further reinforced by the fact that this has no scaling damage. But the damage this can deal is pretty decent, especially with a half decent build. Primal Rage is Primal Fury's augment. It applies a 10% critical chance buff that stacks, but only lasts for 10 seconds, which isn't great, and overall makes the augment quite bad. Steel Path. Wukong performs decently in Steel Path, with his clone and weapon damage carrying him in terms of DPS. His 2 and 3 give him a nearly unbeatable combo of healing and a literal immortality phase, as well as an armor buff for a duration. And his 4 deals consistent DPS and can also build combo for other weapons with its attack speed and range. His 1 is used to create a clone, buffing his DPS considerably, and also works as a distraction in a pinch. His 2 is great survivability and mobility, healing greatly as well, as making him move faster and become invisible for the duration. His 3 makes him literally immortal for the duration, then deals decent damage at the end, before converting it into an armor buff for a duration, greatly increasing his survivability. And his 4 is consistent DPS, but still lackluster in terms of its damage compared to normal melees, but is still no slouch itself. His playstyle consists of using his 1 to double his overall DPS, using his 2 for mobility / healing, using his 3 at the start of an engagement to both initiate with a decent burst of damage, and also give him lasting survivability and the armor buff, then using your 4 to deal the rest of the damage or a melee for the same outcome. He doesn't really benefit from the helmet system, as all his abilities are decent, and his 4 is barely the weakest of them. Overall, the Monkey King himself is a shadow of the useless immortal monkey he once was, and now effortlessly destroys hordes of enemies, while remaining nearly immortal with the many damage reductions and healing options at his disposal. His 1 is just a net DPS buff, his 2 is great mobility, and healing his 3 is literally immortality, provides damage and a lasting damage reduction buff, and his 4 is just really consistent high damage. B+. Zaku, non-applicable. As I've made abundantly clear at this point, especially with the Lavos section, I hate farming the Cambion Drift for materials, and as such, have not obtained Zaku yet. Ureli, ability showcase. Sea Snares. Ureli releases water spheres to seek out and trap nearby enemies. This is an AoE CC ability that immobilizes enemies in spheres of water. This is a decent CC that also has some form of scaling DPS. Unfortunately, the CC doesn't amplify damage, because if it did, this would have some insane damage potential with it already being a great CC. Merylina. Ureli boards her trusty K-Drive Merylina, granting her damage reduction. This is a mobility / survivability ability that allows for Ureli to move faster across the area on her K-Drive, and also grant her 75% damage reduction. The problem comes with this essentially forcing you to run her too if you want to survive, which in turn forces you to both use the clunky K-Drive controls and your secondary, which is easily the worst of the weapon types at the moment. Aqua Blades. Ureli unleashes a revolving circle of blades around her, damaging enemies in the vicinity. This is an AoE DPS ability that also applies slash procs. The damage the attack deals by itself is pitiful, but the slash procs can let her deal the damage required for higher levels, with the downside of a low time to kill. An okay DPS ability with the downside of low time to kill, and as most slash proc oriented DPS sources are. Riptide. Ureli forms a Riptide, damaging enemies caught in it. This is an AoE DPS / CC ability that sucks enemies into a Riptide before exploding, dealing heavy damage to them and sending them flying. The DPS portion of this ability is actually quite decent, with the damage scaling off the amount of enemies inside the Riptide, which leads to an amazing combo with her 1. But the CC portion is quite bad, with it being a knockback CC, which in my opinion is one of the worst forms of CC in the game. Steel Path. Ureli's performance is okay in Steel Path, with her 1 and 4 being used for the main CC and DPS respectively, and using her 2 for clunky but consistent survivability, with her 3 being used for consistent DPS but having a slow time to kill. Her 1 is used to CC a large group of enemies, then combining that with her 4 to deal massive damage, due to how her 4 scales. Her 2 is used for survivability purposes and mobility, The problem is the clunkiness of the controls and the fact it forces you to use your likely weakest weapon in your secondary. Her 3 is consistent DPS with the only issue of a slow time to kill, making it unreliable for getting kills quickly. And her 4 is the DPS option, combining beautifully with her 1 for a nice damage combo due to how this ability scales with the amount of enemies present. Her main playstyle consists of using her 1 and 4 to deal the majority of the damage and CC large groups of enemies, using her 2 to avoid being insta-killed, and using her 3 for consistent but slow DPS. She doesn't really benefit from the helmet system, with her worst ability being core to her overall gameplay, and the others being good enough to justify not replacing. Overall, the newly dubbed waifu frame is decent with good CC in her 1, decent survivability in her 2, okay damage in her 3, and a decent scaling DPS in her 4. The Spirit of Yoreli comes in at a B. Zephyr, Ability Showcase. Tailwind. Zephyr bursts forward quickly in any direction. This is a mobility ability with a DPS element. Zephyr zooms in any direction, including the sky. Using this ability again when in midair will cause her to dive bomb, dealing minuscule damage. The best use of this ability is quick map traversal and nothing else, with the damage it dealing being a non-factor. Target fixation is Tailwind's augment. It applies a damage buff to Tailwind per enemy hit. The problem is that Tailwind has no damage, and this buff does nothing to help it. Airburst. Zephyr launches a projectile of air, launching nearby enemies and damaging them. This is an AoE CC/DPS ability that launches enemies away upon impact. This is actually a pretty decent CC after the change, as you can now crowd enemies to spot with this by simply tapping the ability again, allowing you to effectively combine this with her 4, her main DPS tool. The DPS, while scaling, is pretty poor, and as such the ability is best used as a CC to group them into her 4, or to increase the size of the tornadoes after using her 4. Airburst rounds is Airburst's augment. It applies a crit buff to her secondary when Airburst hits an enemy. This is an okay augment. Turbulence. Zephyr summons a windshield, deflecting all projectiles. This is a survivability ability that deflects projectiles effectively, but she still takes damage from status conditions, melee damage, and AoE explosions or AoE weapons. This is actually quite a decent survivability tool, effectively making her completely immune to range attacks outside of the status conditions they can inflict. Jetstream is Turbulence's augment. It applies a movement speed and fire rate buff, which doesn't help this at all, and makes the augment useless in almost every situation. Tornado. Zephyr summons a tornado, engulfing and damaging nearby enemies. This is an AoE DPS tool that damages enemies and absorbs the element shot into it by Zephyr and allies, greatly increasing the damage dealt. This can also be combined with her 2 to increase the size of the tornadoes. This is a great DPS tool and can be adopted to each enemy type due to the ability to change the status condition its damage is affected by. Funnel Clouds is Tornado's augment. Its effect is spawning 8 additional tornadoes that are half the size and cannot drag enemies into them. This is somewhat helpful, damaging large groups of enemies, but the original ability can actually hit a lot more enemies in total, making it slightly better than its augmented equivalent. Steel Path. Zephyr performs far better than I was expecting, as she used to be one of the most useless frames in the entire game, but now that her tornadoes and airbursts deal decent damage and can effectively crowd and CC, make her much, much better. Her 1 is solely used for map traversal with no other effect that's worth using due to the dive bomb damage being a complete non-factor. Her 2 is used to crowd enemies into an area to then use her 4, and then use her 2 to increase the size of the tornadoes, and that leads to her best DPS combo of her 2 and 4. Her 3 is used as a very good survivability tool that essentially makes her immune to all ranged damage, and because she can easily play outside of melee range, essentially means all she has to worry about is status damage. Her 4 is a great AoE adaptive DPS tool that deals the status effect applied by Zephyr or allies, and can be combined with her 2 for great damage, and her 2 is also used to gather enemies to maximize the value of her 4's damage. Her playstyle consists of using her 1 to traverse the map quickly, using her 2 to CC and crowd enemies, to then use her 4 to deal the bulk of the damage. She then uses her 3 to negate all range damage, which effectively makes her immune to range damage of any type, but status based, and her 4 is a great adaptable DPS source that can be buffed with her 2. The helmet system doesn't benefit her, as all of her abilities serve purposes and serve them well. Overall, the Chicken Lady is in a far better state than she has ever been in the history of the game, with her 2 having decent CC now, her 3 making her immune to any range damage, and her 4 being a great adaptable DPS that scales due to the weapon damage inflicted, makes the Chicken Lady extremely good right now, and easily her best rating ever in a B. And with that, we're done! Thank you to all the following people for giving me the motivation to finally complete this now 3-year long video project. These are Techno, Chart, Amadeus, and Crazy K-Man. Thanks for watching everyone. Bye!